Witam Państwa na czwartej już i ostatniej części konferencji Zagubiona, awangarda, Teresa Żarnower i lewica artystyczna. Tę część konferencji prowadzić będzie pani doktor Agnieszka Rejniak-Majewska, która pracuje w Instytucie Filozofii Uniwersytetu Łódzkiego. Jest autorką licznych tekstów na temat sztuki współczesnej, w szczególności zajmuje się problematyką transmedialności, jak zrozumiałem, ale nie tylko, a również problematyką modernizmu uchodźczego. Napisała wiele tekstów również na temat awangardy historycznej, przynajmniej kilka z nich znam. No, przekazuję jej głos, proszę bardzo. Jeszcze dodam tylko, że w zeszłym roku była stypendystką na University of Chicago. Proszę bardzo.
Dziękuję bardzo, witam Państwa serdecznie. No, jest to akurat ostatni już niestety panel w tej konferencji poświęcony temu, w jaki sposób kondycja wygnania czy emigracja wpływała na twórczość artystów, nie tylko Żarnowerówny, ale również innych i tutaj o jakby szeregu różnych jakby przykładów będziemy mówić. A takim punktem, który wydaje mi się jakby szczególnie istotny jakby w tych wystąpieniach tutaj zebranych, jest jakby problem, w jaki sposób przemieszczenie, dyslokacja, wygnanie przekładało się na pewną formę artystyczną, na poetykę. W jaki sposób to doświadczenie, które mogło być traumatyczne, ale mogło też być w jakiś sposób wyzwalające, pozostawiało inskrypcję jakby w twórczości artystów. No to wrócimy także na pewno do tego wątku, który jakby ciekawie pojawił się pod koniec dyskusji w poprzednim panelu, czyli tej traumatycznej ekspresji, która jest charakterystyczna dla późnej twórczości Teresy Żarnower i która także jakby wraca w bardziej współczesnych kontekstach, w związku też jakby z pamięcią tamtych czasów i tej wojennej traumy. Teraz chciałabym oddać głos pani Adrian Anagnost, która obecnie reprezentuje University of Chicago, bo jest nam doktorantką. Ukończyła historię sztuki na University of Columbia i zajmuje się europejskimi awangardami międzywojennymi, tradycją konstruktywizmu w takim już szerszym, także powojennym i międzynarodowym kontekście, w szczególności sztuką brazylijską dwudziestowieczną i sztuką współczesną. Proszę bardzo.
So today I'm going to discuss Teresa Żarnower not within the context of interwar Poland or the post-war US specifically, but as an emigre artist. And I'm thinking about her in relation to a whole slew of Eastern European artists of the early 20th century whose careers were shaped by the position, their positions in relation to a transnational avant-garde and these transnational artistic networks, as well as by migration. And in the case of these three artists, Lazar Segal, Teresa Żarnower, and Leopold Haar, migration to the Western Hemisphere. And I argue that these historical factors not only shaped these artists' practice, but also art historical interpretations of their work. And I concur with the organizers of the symposium that the difficulty of situating artists like Żarnower firmly within a single time and place has certainly limited our understanding, or a sort of broader understanding of her work. And especially given exhibition practices and museological conventions that are often oriented around a very specific time and place, historical movements, or a sort of ahistorical morphology on the other hand. And so I'm really looking forward to the way this exhibition, the future exhibition, will recontextualize Żarnower. And what I'm going to argue today is, or how I want to position Żarnower today, is not less as a strictly Polish artist and not so much as a North American artist, but in the context of avant-garde networks, in particular avant-garde networks transferring from Europe to the Americas. And without reiterating a sort of pernicious stereotype of the wandering Jew, I want to take seriously the fact that Żarnower was, like many fellow emigres, Jewish, and was compelled to migrate due to anti-Semitic violence in the early 20th century Europe. And so I'm taking her as an exemplary but by no means unique case in discussing these artistic networks. So to just give you a sense of the three artists, we have Lazar Segal, who born in Vilnius in 1891 and died in São Paulo in 1957. Teresa Żarnower, Warsaw, 1897, New York, 1949, and Leopold Haar, Tarnow, 1910, and São Paulo, 1954. And we'll see how those beginning and end points actually conceal a much more complicated trajectory for all three of them, or less in the case of Żarnower. I won't go into that since we've heard so much about it, but I'm going to go into it more with Segal and Haar. And I want to use Segal and Haar as comparisons and to kind of pluck out key points of Żarnower's experience and how that affected both her practice and our art historical interpretations. So how did Segal's position as a Lithuanian Jew affect the course of his training differently than Żarnower's, for example? And why was Leopold Haar's work basically uninterrupted by World War II, whereas World War II was a huge hiatus in Żarnower's career? And so I want to put these three artists side by side to sort of think about the specificities of Żarnower's practice in particular. And I want to also stress the fact, and what I'm really going to be coming back to again and again, is the way that Żarnower's solitariness in the post-war period has really not only, I think, limited her ability to continue her career, but also shaped the way that we understand her as an artist. And you'll see that the way I discuss Segal and Haar is consistently as part of artist groups. And so I think, as we've seen from the earlier talks, the lack of critical attention is in some ways the result of being solitary and not part of an artist group. And in contrast, Segal and Haar sort of consistently found collaborators when they migrated, and you'll see why that's the case in a moment. So. And I just want to really emphasize the sort of topology of these artists' practice, and we've sort of alluded to these maps at several points, but I really want to reiterate this sort of changing borders in Europe over the course of Żarnower's and these artists' lives. So I'm going to start with Segal, who was born in Vilnius when it was still part of the Russian Empire. When Poland was still partitioned among Prussia, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. And so I'm going to give a brief overview of Segal's career, and then I'm going to compare him to Haar, and then compare him to Żarnower, and then I'll come back to Haar and compare him to Żarnower. So Lazar Segal was born in Vilnius, then part of the Russian Empire, and attended some drawing classes in Vilnius before moving to Germany as a teenager, just after the turn of the century. So he studies in Berlin, he studies in Dresden. And here you can see that he's working with idioms, some of the Picasso's proto-Cubist works, but by way of, I would argue, the early 20th century Russian avant-gardes. And so I'm positioning Segal, coming from Vilnius, moving to Germany, but still, in some senses, looking eastward. And here we can see him in reference to Picasso. So I'm going to be making a kind of visual argument behind me, so I hope you'll bear with me with them. And here you can see again his relationship to Picasso. And though Segal in the early part of the century, when he was in Germany, returned to Vilnius pretty frequently, World War I really prevented him from traveling. And we see him as an artist sort of struggling with this sense of, where do I belong? I mean, he's already an emigre from Vilnius, from a sort of Russian Vilnius or a Litvak Vilnius to Germany. And then during the war, he's prevented from going back to Vilnius, but at the same time, he's expelled from the Dresden Academy, and he's threatened with internment as a foreign national, as a Russian citizen. And he actually responds by, in his later autobiographical accounts, exaggerating this wartime threat of internment, and he actually has claimed later that he was interned. And the art historian who's done the most to discuss Lazar Segal in the English language, E.D. Wolff, has talked about Segal as romanticizing his place within these his fellow artist captives. And for Wolf, Segal's sort of fabrications, later fabrications about his time being interned during the war, were a result of guilt over his good fortune not to be interned. And in my view, I want to think about this more in terms of Segal's search for a community, and specifically an artistic community, because I think this is a constant struggle for all three of these artists as they sort of move from place to place. And so I think his sense of identity as an artist is emerging from work with and against a group of colleagues, which is he's being prevented from doing because of the war. So in 1917, 1918, when he's able to travel again a little bit more freely, he does return to Vilnius, and here he gathers a lot of material for later works. Here we can see there's works from the 1920s when he's gone back to Germany. And he gathers this source material. He fills sketchbooks with drawings of Jewish life in Vilnius, which at this point is contested territory, and this becomes source material for a lot of the rest of his later works. But he doesn't stay in Vilnius, perhaps, understanding that it's going to be fraught there. And of course it changes hands several times in the Polish and Russian wars, and then is a part of Poland. So he actually, and here we see the map, and you can see Vilnius is up here, has now been absorbed into Poland. There is an independent Lithuania, but it doesn't include Vilnius, and Vilnius is at this time ethnically split between Lithuanian and Poles, and Kaunas is actually the sort of nominal capital. So in the post-war period, the post-World War I period, Segal returns to Dresden, and there he becomes part of the Dresden secession. And I'm really just going to show you a series of images so you can see him sort of working with and against the members of that group, and he's clearly working against his fellow artists in Dresden. And I also want to point to this painting in particular because it's currently on display in New York as part of the Degenerate Art exhibition that sort of tries to recreate the Antarktische Kunst exhibition at the Neue Galerie. And here we can see him working, another Dresden secessionist, Felix Müller, and again Otto Dix. So taking his material from Vilnius, so this work on the left, this etching on the left, is called Memories of Vilnius, and he's working with his source material that he gathered in Vilnius, but sort of responding to a more general post-war context that's much more familiar to us, I think, in terms of George Gross and Otto Dix. And at the same time that he's a member of the Dresden secession, Segal continues to sort of struggle with his place within a community of artists. And so, for example, Felix Müller, his fellow who left the Dresden secession because they weren't political enough, actually describes, as he tries to gather his fellow artists to join the Communist Party, he describes Segal's position in this way, quote, "Segal, he was a Jew and a Pole, thus a foreigner. For that reason, he could belong to no German party," end quote. And so I think we see, Segal's uneasy position in, despite being a member of this artistic group, still finding politically his place a little bit fraught. And so I also want to point to the fact that even as he is dealing with some explicitly Jewish content in his works, he resisted being identified in that way professionally. And for example, in 1922, when he was invited by Polish Jewish artist Jan Adler to exhibit as part of the Russian Jewish delegation to the Erste Internationale Kunstausstellung in Düsseldorf, he says no, he will participate, but he participates as a member of the Dresden secession, not as part of the Russian Jewish delegation. So he's very explicitly positioning himself as part of an artistic community, but a Dresden artistic community. And so I see this as a key issue for him throughout his career. And just briefly, this is a small image of his work in the Antarktische Kunst exhibition. And I'm going to skip this for time constraints. So in 1922, with the Dresden secession kind of breaking up and the Weimar Republic in economic turmoil and political upheaval, Segal briefly moves to Berlin before deciding to leave Germany and move to Brazil. And there he joined several members of his family who had previously emigrated and who had settled there. And eventually, I think basically 3/4 of his sisters and brothers and his father would resettle there. And he finds a very strong community of Lithuanian Jews as well as Polish Jews and Russian Jews in São Paulo. And São Paulo at this time is really starting to be a sort of bustling city. And so he develops connections in this network and within an artist network. And I want to show that just as in Dresden he becomes part of a group and was working with and against other artists, in Brazil he continues to kind of bounce off what other artists are doing. Although I would argue that these works from Brazil are less successful. And Segal, I think in his letters he expresses a similar sentiment, because he complained about Brazil's sort of stifling or limited intellectual life. So, actually, I'm gonna go back. So he remains in Brazil for 5 years, and then he actually returns to Europe, which I think is something that's we forget about, but that artists sometimes went west, but then went back east. And so he moved, this time not back to Germany, but he moved to Paris with his wife that he had met in Brazil. And he said he was bored with Brazil, that there wasn't enough cultural life there, and he really wanted to be back in a sort of very lively European cultural scene. So he goes back to Paris in 1928, and he spends about 5 years there before they end up deciding to move back to Brazil. And there's not a lot of work from this period. I'm not going to show any because there's just very little work. And I think much of the reason for that is, again, this solitariness. And so I want to put that in dialogue with Żarnower's post-war solitariness. He doesn't speak French, or he speaks, practically no French, and he didn't develop social relationships in Paris. And so he's really left his own devices. And he certainly writes about, being very excited to be able to see lots of avant-garde works. But there's little production, and I argue that that's due to this lack of an sort of artistic community or sort of artist group. And upon returning to Brazil in the 30s, he actually tries to sort of initiate artistic groups. He tries to start a society, a pro-modern art society, and he tries to start an art school. And these attempts really fail, and historians have variously attributed this to the Depression or anti-Semitism in Brazil, but he just never really kind of carves out a group, a place for himself in a group, although he does continue his production in Brazil. And so by the late 1930s, with news of the Holocaust trickling into Brazil and in dialogue with a socially conscious mural movement there, he begins working on these large-scale paintings that deal with social themes, but often specifically Jewish issues. And this is Emigrant Ship. And so here we can see that it's in dialogue with some of the sort of the mural movement in Brazil, which is sort of parallel to, but has a different set of stakes at play than the Mexican muralist movement. So for me, I think these later works are, to me, less successful than his earlier Dresden works, and I think a lot of it has to, that fact has to do with his lack of sort of an artistic community. Although I do think there is something interesting, and in response to Tom Sandqvist's presentation yesterday, I found the idea of a sort of anti-hierarchical composition very interesting in thinking about Lazar Segal's 40s and post-war works. So while you could see them in a sort of interesting dialogue with this post-war all-over composition, to me he kind of loses this kind of impetus to be creative as an artist, and I think that to me is due to the lack of finding an artistic community in Brazil. And ironically, though, it's his work following his move to Brazil that has received the most critical attention. And here I'm showing you an artwork by Segal from after he moves to Brazil the first time that's considered a sort of canonical work of Brazilian modernism. And to me, this is just not as successful as his earlier Dresden works, yet it is the key, really a key work for Brazilian modernism. And so I think this is an interesting historiographical issue, because while Segal is sort of a footnote to histories of 20th century Lithuanian or Polish or German art, he's a towering figure for German modernism. And to be frank, in my opinion, it's his less successful works that have been canonized. And I think here we have a really interesting point of comparison with Żarnower, because he's inscribed into historical narratives based on his time in the Americas. At the same time, it's quite distinct from Żarnower because he has about 30 years in Brazil to produce work, whereas Żarnower is in the US for less than a decade before her death. The other issue I think that's very important when comparing the Brazilian context to the US context, or São Paulo and New York specifically, is that with the relatively smaller number of artists in São Paulo, particularly those with direct experience of the European interwar avant-gardes, his experience was held in very high esteem. And so even if his works, to my eyes and perhaps to yours, following his move to Brazil, seem very derivative, it was his sort of first-hand experience in Dresden, in Paris, in Berlin, that helped make him this sort of towering figure in the Brazilian scene. And so here I want to take, I know I've thrown a lot of information at you and a lot of images at you, but I want to take this as a sort of comparative, a point of comparison with Żarnower's career, and to think about the historiographical issues. So despite the controversy over birth date, Żarnower and Segal are roughly contemporaries, and their practices, to me, exemplify the range of aesthetic concerns exhibited by their generation, the artists who came of age in the 19-teens and 20s, although perhaps due to their slightly different age, they have different allegiances. It's expressionism in the case of Segal and constructivism in the case of Żarnower. And in part, in addition to those age differences, you have their origins in Vilnius versus in Warsaw. And so Segal went to Berlin and Dresden for training at a point when expressionism is really what's going on in German avant-garde circles, whereas Żarnower trains in a newly independent Poland in which artists and architects are thinking about a new visual affirmation of modernity in terms of constructivist aesthetics. Although, and I think this is an interesting point, which we haven't really touched on in her earlier works very much, but I'm very fascinated by the way that these early works fit very strangely within a constructivist paradigm. I know we talked about the sort of inside-outside aspect of this briefly yesterday, but I think there's a lot more to be gained from really thinking about the strangeness of these formally, although it's hard to characterize her early work since we have so little evidence. And I think there's been a very different approach in terms of scholarship via Segal and Żarnower, in part because of these stylistic differences and the ways that their art practices were thus able to be transported across national boundaries. And so Segal continuing the practice, this is just a point of comparison, I'll just rush through these briefly. So Segal, moving from Dresden, from Germany to Brazil, he really continues as an expressionist project. We don't see a whole lot of stylistic shift as he moves. And he finds fertile ground in Brazil. It's found a very receptive ground for the type of work he's doing, a sort of light social criticism, a sort of softly expressionist aesthetic, and which I argue that he kind of tones down once he gets to Brazil. And so I think that while he incorporates a slightly different range of themes, here we have, instead of the Jewish ghetto and the Jewish beggar, we have this sort of Afro-Brazilian woman in the favela, hypersexualized. It's a slightly different, approach, but there's a similarity in themes, and he sort of just transposes his expressionist past to Brazil. And in contrast, we see that Żarnower's practice undergoes a shift. I mean, we've talked about this over and over, how she leaves constructivism behind. She's no longer working in the same idiom. And so this is her earlier works. And in one sense, this makes perfect sense if we agree with Benjamin Bucklow's claim that constructivist practices in the post-war period were merely aestheticized versions of a truly politicized avant-garde that emerged in Soviet Russia and Central Europe. On the other hand, I think I want to return to this text by Barnett Newman that we've hovered around several points, which offers a slightly different account of her stylistic shift. So, of course, Żarnower now, in 1946, in her first exhibition of work done here in the United States, in New York, feels that purist constructions in a world that she has seen collapse around her into shambles and personal tragedy are not enough, that an insistence on absolute purity may be total illusion. And so there's a way in which this does chime with Buchlo's account in his sort of Cold War constructivism, where he takes down Naum Gabo for basically being a big corporate shill, as opposed to the real radical constructivists of the pre-war. And so on the one hand, there's a way in which this does chime with Buchlo's account, because there's a sense that constructivism in the post-war period is ideologically empty, and that in light of the tragic end of modernist and avant-garde projects, as they found themselves perverted or realized, depending on your point of view, in Nazism, Stalinist totalitarianism, or corporate aesthetics, in light of this sort of tragic end, that constructivism can only be empty in the post-war period. But I want to highlight something here that, in contrast to Buchlo's critique, Newman is offering a very sort of personal take on Żarnower's shift away from constructivism. So in this account, it's Żarnower's personal tragedy that led to her insight that absolute purity is illusion. And while Buchlo's argument centered on Naum Gabo's very strategic entrepreneurial self-fashioning and his kind of takeover of the rhetoric of the constructivist avant-gardes, here we have a slightly different account. Although both fall into this, again, and we've spoken about this, or applied this MoMA Alfred Barr art historical approach in the U.S. Sorry, I'm just going to turn off so I don't keep hearing it. We've spoken about how in the U.S., and Serge Guilbault mentioned this morning, the right-hand half of this diagram, it kind of falls out in the post-war U.S. and into France to some extent, even while it continues to be a crucial player in a lot of parts of the world. In Brazil, for example, in certain parts of Central and Eastern Europe, and to some extent in France, there's certainly a strand of geometric abstraction. And so there's a historiographical issue at play here that I think Barnett Newman's account doesn't get at. And I want to really emphasize this because I think it's a real problem, especially in terms of female artists. And this is something, again, we've talked about several times. I want to compare Newman on Żarnower to Evelyn Bois and Katarzyna Kobro, who argues that, quote, the abrupt and apparently definitive halt to Kobro's career is usually attributed to the birth of a daughter, then to the war and Nazi persecutions, then to post-war depression and persecutions. It is obvious that all these factors are relevant. I simply do not believe that they explain everything. And I want to really foreground this and agree in the case of Żarnower as well. And I'm not trying to diminish the sort of trauma and tragedy, but I think that as with Bois, I don't believe that these factors explain everything. And I want to call attention to this because it's a particular problem in sort of the psychologizing of female artists in particular. And I think one thing that's important to remember as well is that Żarnower's personal tragedy, in fact, predates the violence of World War II. And we mentioned yesterday that she lost her partner and her artistic collaborator, Sztuki, in a mountaineering accident in 1927. And it's true that in following his death, her practice did shift to some extent. They had been collaborating on journals together, and she continued those projects briefly after his death, but then shifted away. But this personal tragedy didn't affect I think the larger commitments of her career, in particular her political commitments. She continued with graphic design projects that were featured in Marxist literary journals and socialist workers' publications and campaign broadsides for left-wing parties. And I also want to think seriously about Bois' argument that, as with Kobro, with her shift being a sort of natural outgrowth of a sort of organic development in her practice, I think we can look at Żarnower's practice and think about the transition following Sztuka's death as a sort of organic process as well. And I also think that the context of interwar Poland is very important in this respect. I think one of the reasons that, for example, architectural projects, these sort of visionary architectural projects, drop out in Żarnower's practice is less because of a traumatic break with Sztuka's death, and more because of the fact that by the late 20s and early 30s, you have a professionalization of architecture in Poland. And so people, for example, like Simon and Helena Sierkas, are actually participating in the International Congress of Modern Architecture. They're actually producing designs of buildings that are built. And the kind of, I'm sorry, I don't have any images of Sztuka and Żarnower's architectural projects, but it's more of a visionary architecture that's never meant to be built, or that's not sort of practical. And so this sort of visionary artistic approach to constructivism in interwar Poland actually gets supplanted, I argue, by a professionalization of architecture in this interwar period. And so as this avant-garde utopianism of Żarnower's earlier work meets concrete reality in the 20s and 30s, someone who's not trained as an architect, as Żarnower is not, is either less equipped or less inclined to follow through on this aspect of her practice. And so I think the medium of photomontage, as we've seen, offers a way to follow through on this sort of world making that's independent of social applicability or of institutional structures. And again, the real world starts to intervene in the 30s with this sort of narrowing of options for Jewish artists in Poland. And I'm going to, we saw this, I'll briefly skip over this. And so I think that thinking about tragedy, first of all, I've tried to sort of shift the conversation from World War II into particular to the earlier tragedy of Sztuka's death, but I still want to trouble the idea that tragedy really caused this sort of break in Żarnower's career. And I think that the sort of earlier architectural and sculptural tropes continue in her work even after Sztuka's death, and actually well after her move away from Poland. And I also think that the post-war diminishment of her production, which we could attribute on the one sense to tragedy and the very practical fact that she's moving around and is unable to develop studio practice and develop to gain materials, I think a lot of it has to do with isolation. I think not having an artistic group to work against and not having her partner Sztuka, for example, to work with and against is a real loss and is a real obstacle to develop as an artist. And we discussed this morning in Alice McMahon's paper was a really wonderful account of these attempts by Żarnower in New York to sort of reach out and develop an artistic community, but then that never kind of came to fruition. And I think relying on the sort of psychologizing can limit our view, and I really think that emphasizing the networking, as we've discussed several times, is a really important rehistorization of her practice. And I'm going to turn now to Leopold Haar, because in some ways, though Segal and Żarnower were roughly contemporaries, he may not be the best comparison, because despite their similar in ages, Segal was working in an expressionist style, where Żarnower is doing the constructivism, photomontage side of things. And another comparison is between Żarnower and Leopold Haar, who was born as Czaskiel Springer. So he's a Polish Jew born in Tarnów, and he did some studies at the Krakow Academy of Applied Arts, and then he spent the 1930s as a jazz musician touring southern Poland with his brother Zygmunt Haar. And so when World War II brought Poland under German control, the Haar brothers, possibly after imprisonment in Poland, although I can't confirm this, snuck over the border into the Soviet Union to join the Polish army in exile. And this is a really fascinating story, which was briefly alluded to yesterday with Anders' army, where the Polish army in exile in the Soviet Union, after relations between Poland and the Soviet Union became strained, the Polish Second Corps actually marched overland through Central Asia, through Iran, Iraq, Jordan, the British made it to Palestine and Egypt before going over the Mediterranean to Italy and participating in the Battle of Monte Cassino, the sort of very famous and ill-fated Battle of Monte Cassino. And just briefly, if you've seen Monuments Men, this is a key point for George Clooney's character as he tries to enlist the government help to save artistic treasures, because Monte Cassino is this building full of paintings and manuscripts and all sorts of things that was heavily bombed by the Allies, although much of the work was removed beforehand. That's just a side note. So Leopold Haar, I think, is an interesting figure. None of his pre-war work really remains, so I can't show you any of that, but I want to show you what he did during the war. And he, as part of the Polish Second Corps, he served in the sort of propaganda and poster and design division. And he did things like design this pin for the Polish Second Corps using the mermaid motif. He designed posters that were published by in Britain, sort of a collaboration with the Polish government in exile in Britain. And here's an actual sort of poster diagram of the battle for Monte Cassino. And he also did, and I think this is another interesting point of comparison with the Teresa Żarnower and her Ogrodowa design, because he also was doing book design in this era. And this is another, I was really struck yesterday when we were talking about the Defense of Warsaw book, because I suddenly saw a really interesting formal comparison here, which I'm really curious to figure out if Haar ever actually saw Żarnower's work, which I'm not sure if things were going from the US back to London or Italy, where he was after the war, but I'm very curious. So while Haar's trajectory is fascinating to me in and of itself, what's important for my argument today is that he was consistently in this period working alongside an artistic collaborator. He and his brother, with whom he'd been a traveling musician in the 30s, they were together sticking over the border. So even the whole march through Central Asia and the Middle East and the travel overseas to Italy. And in the post-war period, they opened up a design studio in Rome, and they spent several years there. And this time in Rome, actually, there were many Polish soldiers who had come through Italy, and there were a lot of Poles in Rome, including Józef Jarema, who was involved with Italian artist Enrico Prampolini to develop an art club. So there's a big artistic community, even in the immediate post-war period, very international community. So I think I also want to position World War II, yes, it's a break, yes, it does kind of, there is that rupture with the interwar avant-gardes, but there's in some way there's a sort of immediate, at least attempt to return to these artistic communities. And it's also likely in Rome that Haar developed contacts that drew him to Brazil, where he almost immediately began exhibiting. And so here I'm showing you a 1950, a small exhibition pamphlet where Haar and his brother exhibit together. And so again, I want to emphasize there's this sort of built-in artistic community, a built-in colleague as the Haar brothers travel together. And here we have, this is an exhibition called Vitrines and Photographs, where Leopold was designing displays for vitrines, and his brother Zygmunt was doing these photographs. So the bottom two are the vitrine designs, clearly inspired by Klee and possibly Calder, although I can't confirm that. And the two photographs up top are Zygmunt Haar's. And almost immediately after arriving in Brazil, Haar also gets involved with a renowned concrete art group in Brazil, in São Paulo, called Ruptura, or Rupture. And their 1952 exhibition has been regarded, again, as a watershed in Brazilian art. And though Haar's early works have all been lost, photographs from these early exhibitions show him working through issues of abstraction and industrial design, thinking about constructivism in a very applied arts way, in similar to Marek Bartolik's talk this morning, thinking about the relationship of constructivism to commercialism. So Haar was doing these two types of sculptures, and he exhibited the type on the right with no branding on it as a sculpture. And the part on the left, he would display it as a vitrine display, but it was not included in the sort of fine art exhibitions in São Paulo. And so I want to also position this, think about Brazil as an alternative site, in contrast to Benjamin Bucklow's account of constructivism in the post-war US, or perhaps post-war Europe, as a sort of empty ideological gesture. I want to offer Leopold Haar and his fellow constructivists as thinking through the sort of this relationship of the fine arts to design, the fine arts to applied arts, in a way that doesn't neatly fit into Bucklow's criticism of Gabo. And so I think this engagement with design, against Gabo, to my mind, I'm not sure that it disproves Bucklow's claim, but I just want to complicate it a little, because I think the Brazilian context and similarly the post-war European contexts are a little different than the US. And like Leopold Haar, several of his colleagues in the Ruptura group also were working both in the fine arts and the applied arts. And this is Valdemar Cordeiro, whom he met in Rome and reconnected with in Brazil. Jorge Barros, who again, photography and furniture design. Oh, skipping ahead. And so I also want to position Haar potentially in relation to the interwar Polish avant-garde. And I have no evidence that he ever saw works by Katarzyna Kobro. He did pass through Łódź, but it's really impossible to trace when, at what point. But I think I want to draw attention to some morphological similarities that may be entirely coincidental, but I think are very, very interesting to me. At the same time, it wasn't until the post-war period that Haar engaged in these sculptural investigations. And so in contrast with Żarnower, for whom the interwar period was a really fertile period in which she's working in a group and really producing a lot of interesting stuff, it was the post-war period when Haar did most of his work. And for me, a lot of that distinction has to do with the act of finding an artist group or forming artist groups or working in collaboration with other artists. Because it was in the interwar period that Żarnower is in the block group, works very closely with Sztuki, but it's not until the post-war period that Haar becomes part of this concrete art group, a sort of post-war constructivist group in Brazil. And I also want to point out that it's a very theoretically active group in both cases. Block has a journal, the Ruptura group writes manifestos. They're really trying to think through their place in post-war art. Haar writes for kind of art magazines. He writes about his vitrine designs. So, and I think this is in contrast to the sort of Lázaro Segall model, who comes to Brazil and continues his work as a sort of elder statesman, a representative of the European avant-gardes, but really never develops beyond that. He's just there as a sort of idea of European modernism or the European avant-garde, whereas Haar is arriving and really thrives and produces a lot of really interesting work in post-war Brazil because he's in dialogue with other artists. And so here, what I want to suggest somewhat polemically is that artists can produce better or worse work depending on their contexts and depending on with whom they are engaged. And that work with other artists side by side in avant-garde clusters or even pairs drove the best production of these artists. And absent this community, for Segall in the case of Brazil, and Żarnower in the case of New York, they either produce little work or work from, in my mind, Segall's is much weaker after the war. And so even though I titled this paper Collectivity, I think collectivity is really the wrong word here. And I'm thinking here of how T.J. Clark described the relationship between Picasso and Braque in his Cubism and Collectivity chapter. because it was really, even though he also describes it as collectivity, it's really a form of competitiveness, of carving out a new artistic language in these fits and starts and sort of feints and defeats that were driving these radical advances in Cubism. And so what I want to do today with Żarnower's work is argue that if her work in the post-war U.S. has been understudied, which of course it has been, it's part of historiographical problem. As I mentioned earlier, this sort of American Greenbergian bar-inflected modernism is in play. But I also think it's an issue of her production, of her lack of community rooted in this migration. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your speech. We will shift our discussion after the panel at the very end when we listen to these two other presentations. Poproszę teraz panią Nui Banai o jej wystąpienie. Pani Nui Banai jest absolwentką również Columbia University, historyczką i krytyczką sztuki, obecnie związaną z Tufts University, Boston Academy of Arts, i jej zainteresowania skupiają się na sztuce drugiej połowy wieku XX i sztuce współczesnej, i w sposób szczególny ukierunkowane są na kwestię tego, w jaki sposób sztuka współkształtuje sferę publiczną, w jaki sposób to, co estetyczne, wizualne, współtworzy przestrzeń polityczną i społeczną. Pani Nui Banai ukończyła niedawno książkę poświęconą Yves Kleinowi. Nie wiem, czy ona już została wydana. Was it published already? No?
It's not yet.
Okay. I pracuję teraz nad projektem, który dotyczy Europy, wizji Europy w XX wieku, Imagining Europe between nation state and border state.
From nation state?
From, yes. And I think this presentation will be somehow connected with this issue, not related with Europe, but with our immigration of artists from Europe to South America, as well as in the former presentation, but the issue of this social and aesthetic connection.
Thank you to all of you who came today on a Saturday, a beautiful Saturday. And thank you very much for the invitation to come to Łódź. This is my second visit to Poland. The first one was to explore the work of Andrzej Wróblewski, and now I have the chance to come again. So thank you very much, and I look forward to my third visit. So Gertrud Goldschmidt, otherwise known as Gego, was notoriously tight-lipped about her practice, preferring to leave the task of analysis to others, and even more reticent about her biography, which she considered inconsequential to understanding her aesthetic output. Around the time of her major exhibition in Caracas in 1977, she offered some clarifications for this rationale. Quote, "Each life is governed by origins and beginnings, by encounters and adjustments, leading to the present. Self-objectivity is impossible. When I start to analyze my path, I get lost in anecdotes that may be significant in terms of my own memory, but which are totally meaningless and redundant to appreciating my work. The past of all human beings is rooted inside every one of us, and I have ended up with a certain combination of possibilities to do what I do. And if I have ended up with a certain combination of possibilities to do what I do, it has been the result of a multi-dimensional chess game. This explanation, which recognizes the dangers of conflating an artist's life with their art, searching for punctual origins or tracing vulgar lines of causality, ends with an opening towards the quintessential structuralist paradigm, namely the multi-dimensional chess game. Over the last decade, Goldschmidt's practice has been the subject of renewed focus, with exceptionally gifted scholars examining her work as so many diachronic and synchronic movements on a multidimensional chess game. The most dominant concern has been the delineation of the vectors, textures, and temporalities of the artistic, ideological, and symbolic exchanges between the projects of modernism and modernity and postmodernism and postmodernity in Europe and Latin America. It's no surprise, of course, since in Gego's linguistic and visual production, we note a sustained interest in the mapping of space and subjectivity, a material and conceptual weaving that triangulates between the nodes of modernism and politics in the most abstract yet phenomenological ways possible. Despite her reticence to linger on her biographical narrative or to give it any weight in inflecting the hermeneutics of her artistic practice, I would like to proceed from a counter-assumption and entertain a subject that Goldschmidt was not fond of treating, namely the constitution of an aesthetic practice in relation to the conditions of exile. Indeed, in contrast to Żarnower's outcome or fate, Goldschmidt's rise to prominence was linked to her dislocation from the purported center and her relocation to the so-called periphery. Born in Hamburg in 1912 to a typically assimilated middle-class Jewish family, Goldschmidt emigrated to Caracas on the 1st of June 1939, only a few months before the outbreak of World War II, and would, by the end of her life, become celebrated as both a, quote, Venezuelan artist and, quote, a Latin American artist. The passage from Gertrud Goldschmidt to Gego included 18 years as a stateless subject, as she was stripped of her national rights in Germany in 1935 and did not become a Venezuelan citizen until 1952. Like many of her generation, these geographic, political, and juridical displacements enabled Goldschmidt to survive the catastrophe of the Holocaust. But how did the first 27 years of her life as a German and a Jew, and the complex conditions, processes, and experiences of exile imbricate her art practice? While the proposition that exile functioned as both an existential conduit and a structural condition may appear self-evident, this paper goes against the grain of the dominant scholarship and the artist narrativization of her life and practice. Rather than entering into the hermeneutic fray that approaches Gego's stylistic contradictions in purely formal or abstracted terms, on the one hand, or naturalizes her practice within a regional frame, on the other, I would like to go in a different direction and propose a new model through which to understand her modernism. In this shift, I'm particularly indebted to my colleague and art historian Hannah Feldman, who is possibly the first scholar to analyze the complex historical circumstances and ideological forces through which Gego was assigned a national and cultural identity. Her nationalization, Feldman argues, went hand in hand with the Venezuelan government's agenda for modernization and its sponsorship of culture as an ideological vehicle. The 1948 overthrow of the novelist Romulo Gallegos and his replacement by the dictator General Marcos Pérez Jiménez signaled a shift in the country's cultural agenda, with abstract and kinetic art being prioritized over figurative representations or idioms associated with indigenous culture. As Feldman rightly notes, quote, Gego's rapid institutionalization within Venezuelan institutions in the 60s and 70s must be viewed as part and parcel of her position within an officially sanctioned culture, and her quick absorption into institutionality is precisely what lies at the center of contemporary critics' insistence upon Gego's Venezuelanness, unquote. Feldman also observed that Gego's institutionalization was linked to her legibility within the dominant strand of European and North American modernism, which similarly espoused abstraction over figuration in the 50s and 60s. Her international status as an avant-garde artist was sealed by the purchase of a work by the Museum of Modern Art for its Latin American collection in 1959. Feldman writes, quote, it's North America's assumption of rigid and easily determined identities that allows an ideological machine like MoMA to characterize an art as belonging to a national or even regional tradition, even when the shape of that tradition has not yet fully articulated itself in its own place of production, as was the case in Venezuela, unquote. Finally, we have to acknowledge in this discussion the thorny problem of Gego's status as an exile from Germany, and what that would have done, or how that problem would have created, what kind of problem that would have created to her double institutionalization as Venezuelan and Latin America. Therefore, I would like to add that difference had to be erased in order for a streamlined national and regional categorization to occur. And it's this difference that needs to be reinstated into the analysis of Gego's work in order to develop a modernism of exile. So my case study today will raise the following questions. 1, without falling into an essentialist rhetoric, how can we attend to the historical and political specificity of Gego's status as a German and a Jew in order to envisage exile as a significant denominator in the materialization of her modernism? 2, how might we develop exile as a theoretical motor that moves us from and through the grid of stylistic contradictions in which Gego's modernisms have been predominantly understood towards a triangulated matrix that emerges from exile's own structural condition of interstitiality? 3, can we consider one of her important works, the Reticularia, as a spatialization of this experience, a construction that weaves a modernism of exile, a kind of neologism, that proposes another kind of language, body, and sense of one's place in relation to others? And finally, 4, to respond to the call of this conference, how can a refined problematic of exile that is attentive to historical and contemporary procedures of racialization within the modernist nation state help us critique the enduring prevalence of a particular art historical narrative that insists above all else on the elision between avant-gardism and style? So, to begin, to expand on my first question, Gego's entanglements, which contain and construct multiple subject positions and which have been grafted within divergent theoretical, historical, and art historical matrices, also need to be considered through the lens of her German and Jewish identity and within the devastating conditions of wartime displacement. Over a period of 2 years between 1987 and 1989, so towards the end of her life, Gego entered into a rather laconic correspondence with Professor Fritjof Trapp of the University of Hamburg. Under the aegis of the city's Senate, he was directing an investigation called Exile and Emigration of Hamburg Jews, in order to trace the lives of Jews who'd been forced to leave with the rise of Nazism. As expected, Gego's official response to Professor Trapp's questionnaires did not reveal very much, and she rebuffed his repeated advances by stating, quote, "not all Germans were Nazis," unquote. Though it's not within the scope of this presentation to elaborate on the status of Jews in Hamburg from the late 19th century to the outbreak of World War II, and I believe we have a specialist here on that question perhaps, a few additional remarks are essential. In 1910, 2 years before Gego's birth, the German social and economic theorist Franz Hoppenheimer analyzed the difference between the Jews of Eastern and Western Europe. Quote, "We Western Jews," he writes, "have Jewish ethnic consciousness, but Eastern Jews have Jewish national consciousness. Ethnic consciousness rests on the past. It's something you find wherever an individual has the consciousness that he has descended from a nation. But national consciousness concerns the present. It means to share a common language and common customs, to have the same economic and legal position, and to share a common intellectual culture," unquote. Oppenheimer's analysis and his reliance on this specific terminology are based on more than personal experience or attitude. The particularity of German Jewishness, as it was expressed by many at the time, was a mixture of Jewish ethnicity that was a vestige of the past and German nationality that was rooted in the present status of citizenship and identification with contemporary German culture. The German Jews believed that Jewish ethnicity and German nationality could coexist harmoniously. This idea was already severely compromised by the time Hitler came to power in 1933. The State and Imperial Citizenship Law of 1913, which did not explicitly mention Jews, laid the groundwork for Hitler's Aryan laws of the 30s by basing the rights to German citizenship on reason of ethnicity rather than reason of residence. According to Saskia Sassen, quote, "cultural history was replaced by biology, and biology was used by the state as the standard for distinguishing between lasting connections and temporary coexistence, unquote. Though about 80% of the Jews in Germany had legally gained citizenship by the late 19th century and had fully acculturated themselves as Germans, according to this law, they nevertheless lacked German ethnicity. With the Nuremberg laws of 1935, the Reich definitively transformed Germany into a political unity based on blood. Nominally, within the National Socialist Reich, Jews could still be citizens of the state, as this status was safeguarded by the laws of 1913. However, citizenship could only be granted to Germans and related blood, meaning that Jews were effectively stripped of their political rights. Thus, in 1935, along with the other 500,000 German Jews, Gego lost her political rights and state affiliation, and although she settled in Venezuela in 1939, she remained stateless, as I mentioned, till 1952, when she became a citizen of her adopted country. Without overreading or overreaching, it's useful to hear Gego's account of her experience as a German Jew in the 1930s, as it's quite telling. Despite her defensive maneuvers, she did in fact write an autobiographical text following Professor Trapp's suggestions. It should be added that these excerpts, the most comprehensive that she ever penned, remained unsent. Resonating with many other histories of a thoroughly assimilated German Jewish middle class, Gego narrates her early life in this way, quote, "My family was formed at the beginning of the 19th century by citizens and bourgeois of the free city of Hamburg. Our Jewish origin was accepted as fact, and we completely identified with German society, with German and Hamburger tradition and culture. I never visited a synagogue or a temple in the Jewish community, and it was much later that I learned the meaning of anti-Semitism," unquote. To emphasize the utter banality of her Jewish identity, whose ethnic origin went hand in hand with the contemporary culture of German bourgeois humanism, she adds the following words and underlines them in red ink. "Perhaps one of the outstanding characteristics of my education was the respect for ideas, thoughts, and culture other than my own. Another important aspect was the demand to take the community into account, not to bother anyone and not to be bothered. That is to say, to integrate oneself," unquote. In spite of her intentions, Gego articulates the tension experienced by many middle-class Jewish families who experience the push and pull between German ethnicity and nationality as the basis for German Jewish identity. With language as a site for self-construction, Gego's description of herself is one that is only legible within the conditions of assimilated Jewry, a state of exile within the common culture that is at once vigorously denied and implicitly affirmed. Though German Jews may have considered themselves an integral part of German society and were taught to respect the values of others, i.e. non-Germans, non-Western subjects, the demand to integrate themselves into this culture was nevertheless accompanied by a sense of tacit otherness, expressed economically as not to bother anyone and not to be bothered. Indeed, this is not simply the language of a woman who accepts her gendered position within the norms of bourgeois respectability. Rather, this complex discursive self-construction simultaneously posits the individual subject in relation to two national collectives, the German and the Jewish, in which they're integrated and which from they are differentiated. Though she may have not recognized her Judaism as a point of difference, the German state imposed this otherness upon her. And if she identified herself completely as a German, this was also inscribed as an impossibility according to the state's legal definition. Finally, to go against the grain one more time, Gego's narrative is similar to that of many other Jews who did not want to concern themselves with the so-called Jewish problem and preferred to characterize themselves as ordinary immigrants. Though she described the process of her exodus from Germany towards England and eventually to Caracas as emigration, I think it's abundantly clear that her basic condition as a Jewish German subject was constructed on a precarious triangulation that might already be seen as ethnic, cultural, and political state of exile. Though defining exile is not a straightforward matter, it can nevertheless be contrasted to emigration and migration. Unlike the émigré who leaves their country often voluntarily for political, economic, and religious reasons, and the migrant's mobility, a repeated change of domicile often linked to a search for labor, the exile is forced out of his or her home. Exile is thus linked to the state's role in compelling an individual to relocate by deprivation of citizenship, banishment, or persecution. If this banishment is impelled by the state, the derivation of the word, most probably from the Latin exsalire, also communicates the active sense of leaping out towards something or somewhere. Thus, exile contains a sense of forced movement away from one place and an active or creative movement towards a new one. In recent years, more attention has been paid to the dispersal of European artists during the 1930s and 40s, whether through a dynamic of internal exile within their particular homeland or exile to other countries and continents. In tandem, modernism itself has been scrutinized and reconsidered as a model of cultural production that carries with it the subjective imprint of the outsider, as well as the critical position of otherness. In broad terms, of course, some of the most influential social and philosophical contributions of the 19th and 20th centuries, such as Marxism and psychoanalysis, have grafted a sense of interstitial doubling of here and elsewhere in their midst. Post-structuralist and post-colonial theories have also dwelled on the productive possibilities of temporal and spatial deferment and difference, whether in the time of writing or reading, or the emplacement and displacement of national identity formation. From the specific case of Gego's exile, I'd like to move towards the elaboration of exile as a structural condition through which to complicate our understanding of her modernisms. To do so, we need to agree that although experience of exile may be different depending on place, religion, ethnicity, and social status, one common denominator of exile is its configuration of an interstitial reality. In this light, Gego's webbing and weaving of artistic languages and context not only emerges from interstitial cultural, economic, and political topologies of modernism, but imminently imagines a new cartography for a subjectivity whose norm is the state of exception. I'll read that again. In this light, Gego's webbing and weaving of artistic languages and context not only emerges from interstitial cultural, economic, and political topologies of modernism, but imminently imagines a new cartography for subjectivity whose norm is a state of exception. Gego arrived in Venezuela without any knowledge of Spanish and learned the language on site. From carpenters and workers at her lamp factory in the working class district of El Valle. According to Maria Elena Huizi and Josefina Manrique, editors of the collection of Sabiduras, which you see here, Gego absorbed the speaking and writing patterns of those she employed, a language that bore no relation to grammatical purity or formal correctness. Its only concern was to connote meaning effectively, or to effectively communicate. Another of Huizi and Manrique's claims is that Gego's constant search for transparency might explain her reduction of discourse to the bare minimum needed in order to crystallize an idea. And what you're looking at here is a case, a kind of trunk, in which Gego kept her writings. This was a trunk that was only made, was only found much later in Gego's life, which she didn't share for much of her lifetime. Some of her writings were published, those that she considered good enough to leave the box, to leave the trunk, the exile's trunk, but much of it remained in this trunk until her death. And a lot of new scholars, well, the point of departure for my scholarship is from this, is partly from this trunk and its wealth of writing. So when we encounter a word, and sabidura is the word that Gego herself gave this trunk and what it held, the kind of cache of knowledge. When we encounter a word like sabidura, which is the miswritten Spanish word for wisdom, sabiduría, which would be the correct form, such explanations about a desire for effective communication and transparency are not really satisfactory, as Gego's neologism achieves neither and thwarts both. What if we ask the following question instead? How do people who lose their identity reinvent or recreate themselves in a different language? Or what role does exile, if it's understood as an agent of uncertainty, displacement, marginality, and decentering, play in contributing to the artist's elaboration of a new language? Though it's not only in language that Gego plays and performs the possibilities of exile thinking and exile subjectivity, it's certainly one important site in which displacement becomes visible as her creative act. Her neologisms, such as sabidura and reticularia, which I'll look at in a minute, offer an exhilarating experience of a subjectivity that thrives between habitual orders and that insists on locating itself as an intermediary territory. Much like exile, Gego's neologisms exist in zones between the loss of the mother tongue and a lack of full integration into an adopted language. As such, they're not simply sites resonating with a painful deficiency, but are also sites of a restless resourcefulness and imagination. The short but meaningful distance between sabidura and sabiduria is thus both a no man's land of inarticulation and a space of eloquence. Just like the line, which Gego describes as both, quote, human means to express the relations between points and a medium that indicates materially the relation between points in space, unquote, her neologisms are hinged between the spatial coordinates of identity. Following Eva Hoffmann's description of James Joyce and Samuel Beckett's active choice to write in a foreign language as a way to cultivate another form of expression, we may liken the distance between sabidura and sabiduria to the creative transformation of exile. In this particular case, the association with wisdom and knowing adds an additional layer of signification, suggesting Gego's grasp of the power of spatial and linguistic mobility and her quest to enter into different subjectivities, as well as the subjective of another culture and language. Although Gego gave credit to art critic, poet, and curator Roberto Guevara for coining the word reticularia, she was also implicated in conceptualizing its parameters. Sabidura number 7, also titled Air, which you see in front of you right now, consists of 4 separate pages of notation and sheds light on her contribution. At times, Gego's collection of words reads like a careful list of materials composed of nouns or proper names: air, space, emptiness, lights, cereals, trace, endless triangulation. Other times, there are adjectives and verbs peppered with nouns, as with inexhaustible, endless, consecutive traces, linked, continuous, triangulated linkages, cells, which is also what you see in front of you right now. There are occasions when she lapses into Latin, such as idem and ibid, as you see in front of you now, ad finitum and constellum, and other moments when Spanish takes over with habitable and despliegue, which you see here. There are also instances of untranslatability, neologisms within the neologism, for example, reticulum, which you see on the top right, or polyreticle. In this heterogeneous mix, Gego imposes an equalization between the language of different authorities. For instance, the use of the sacred Latin in partnership with the vernacular Spanish brings together the language of the state with that of the population. Approached visually, these linguistic compilations might appear to be delineating spaces, whether by typographical arrangements that carve out blank, open areas and enforce limits, upper or lowercase fonts that suggest mass and magnitude, the addition of grounding lines that emphasize emplacement or borders that erect fortresses. Words, in this case, fabricate a built environment, a materialization enforced by the words such as ibid, short for ibidem, literally meaning the same place, and thus a stationary point, but also asking the reader to consult a reference that came before, thus connoting transit, such as idem, a term used in legal citations and academic references, which also asks the reader to examine an author's previous citation. Here, too, we have different authorities, the academy and the law, each one framed in their own mini-sphere of influence. Gego produces a spatial rhetoric entangled with divergent voices of authority, which become displaced and disempowered by the constant movement. From and to and from, mobility and passage, the same but different, a median state characterized by a restlessness that gives rise to new linguistic combinations and subject positions. Thus, the breakdown of uniform speech in favor of the polyphonic textures, the relation between diverse languages, and the linguistic fabrication of a spatial territory suggests that we've surpassed the static relation between a particular language and a particular territory. Interestingly, while there are many suggestions of multiplicity with words connoting repetition, seriality, and cross-referencing, we notice that the artist's own discursive inscription adopts the singular Latin suffix right there in the middle, as in moleculum gegum. I hope you see that, gegum. Or a gego molecule, and gegum, a gego thing. In Gego's constructed neologism of the reticularia, the artist's self-fashioning is in the guise of a singular organism, a molecule thing, moving through a vast constellation of languages, territories, and networks of power. So I'm basically establishing a kind of mediation through language as a different model of sovereignty, and the way that this becomes a territory for a different kind of self-fashioning, in which there's a constellation of languages and networks of power through which she constructs a triangulation. And now I would like to move to the reticularia. If we now consider Gego's first reticularia, installed at the Museo de Bellas Artes in Caracas in 1969, we may be struck by its materialization of a condition of exile in all its creative possibilities and constraints. Following my line of thought today, I'd like to suggest that exile's territorialization of the subject as an other produces an inscription of otherness in the subject. The linguistic, visual, and spatial neologism of the reticularia articulates this precarious subjectivity. It's an interstitial territory where the I survives, if only as a molecule, carving out a space for its own continued deterritorialization. While this condition is liberating in its eccentricity, as many have noted about the reticularia's potential for ongoing expansion, living in suspension is also an exhausting situation that can similarly become an ideology or a strategy for a discipline. If the exile, he or she who is exiled, cannot feel at home, she can fabricate many points of tension to counteract the potential for infinite drift. Gego's knots are a case in point, and may be considered as an attempt to formulate solutions to questions of identity, subjectivity, and autonomy. Quote, "I work by reason of making," she told José Antonio Pantin in an interview, and accordingly, these little islands are not places of stasis, but places of labor, work, and action. They're instances of decision-making and commitment, places where the artist has actively intervened to iterate a new point of contact. They're also sites in which the artist has made a wager, with each metallic knot opening up a potential scenario for an additional line and another outgrowth, without knowing what the final outcome will be. There's a move away from centralization as an organizing framework towards the margins. Yet there's always another knot that can be added, keeping the margin at bay and maintaining a permanent state of interstitiality. Exile, according to Edward Said, means that you're always going to be marginal. If Gego's marginality has been largely brought about, and this marginality until, I would say, last night, marginality in terms of, let me finish this. If Gego's marginality has been largely brought about by the power relations framing the confrontation between European and Latin American modernism, I've tried to attend to something different in this talk. This would be the structural condition of exile, a form of subjectification that materializes from a state of exception and turns it into an insecure norm. This paper has begun to map the territories of Gego's exile by examining her neologism and the reticularia, but there's still much work to be done on crystallizing the artist's articulation of the experiences of estrangement and identification through her visual and linguistic idioms. There's also, of course, the question of gender, and here we may also ask if Gego operated against conformist models of identity and worked through an exiled stigma of powerlessness by establishing a different model of female autonomy that was directly opposed to the sanctioned norms of identity. I think these questions are extremely important to our understanding of Gego's practice, a practice that transformed the interstitial condition of exile into the center of an aesthetic world without stability, and gave rise to a triangulated modernism with its own agenda for the constitution of subject, social obligation, and political commitments. Thus, with Gego as a case study, we can also take a broader theoretical step and develop a modernism of exile that might help us refine other narratives that have fallen within the strictures of center versus periphery or local versus global. Though grounded in the historical context of the post-war, this paper also anticipates contemporary debates, such as the one offered by T.J. Demos about the centrality of exile and migration within the dominant global framework of the post-national condition. It's telling that in the contemporary context, there's a problematic celebration of post-nationalism which asserts the predominance of a global lingua franca and relegates those who embrace national idioms to merely particularistic concerns or outright obscurity. The case of Gertrud Goldschmidt might help us complicate these two prevailing historical models, which link modernism and modernization with stylistic ruptures within the parameter of the nation-state, and are organized within geopolitical power dynamics of center and periphery. Though the element of capitalism is central to these power dynamics and is often articulated as such, what frequently gets left out of such modernist narratives is the uncomfortable question of the racialization embedded in the construction of the nation-state. To continue discussing the avant-garde imperative to break with the old via stylistic invention is to reproduce a high modernist discourse whose celebration of formal procedures and championing of abstraction evacuates the racialized operation of the European and Latin American nation-state in the years surrounding World War II. To evoke both Michel Foucault and Achille Mbembe, it's racism that functions as the pivotal element in the administration of life and death in populations. And it's in the years surrounding World War II that we can pinpoint a paradigm or a paradigmatic shift from biopolitics, or the management of life, to necropolitics, or the management of death. Indeed, to graph the history of the avant-garde in these terms is also to maintain a paradigm that makes possible the contemporary operation of the European nation-state, as it espouses and normalizes racialized politics. Racism has, one might argue, always been a central category of the modernist nation-state and has been conveniently subordinated in order to privilege the narrative of abstraction. From our position in the present, it's clear that such generalized abstraction has permutated into a model of global capitalism that continues to evacuate history and discriminate, depoliticize, or erase people who do not conveniently sustain the narrative of Europe. By writing a modernism of exile, we reinstate the race as a central category that goes hand in hand with the history of stylistic and economic advancement and abstraction. We make legible an inconvenient dispositif that complicates our understanding of the mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion through which an alternative history of the lost avant-garde can be analyzed and through which the contemporary conditions of art production can be conceptualized. Despite our close examination of cultural production in specific nation-states and our study of wider networks of exchange with both Gego and Teresa Żarnower, perhaps we should point to an even broader question that frames our conference, namely, what are we in the process of doing here with our scholarly production? Are we contributing to ideological operations that animate the disciplinary matrix of art history around the question of Europe? Indeed, the constitution of a uniquely European sphere within which new forms of sovereignty, publics, and models of citizenship are envisioned is itself one of the key problematics that structure the discipline of art history and is intimately connected with cultural production. Can we also reframe our collective analysis in order to make visible how we are articulating the problem of Europe and theorize the ways in which this terrain gained form through processes of cultural production, consumption, transfer, and reception? By critically reassessing the processes, power relations, and orthodoxies that have framed the discipline of post-war and contemporary European art within the model of the nation-state and post-national state, can we also reflect on how this matrix has privileged certain places, peoples, and practices and rendered others marginal? Here I'd like to point to the normative filters that have guided the dominant analysis of the avant-garde, both in the choice of subject matter and in the content that we produce as art historians. And perhaps here I'm speaking more to a public that was trained in the kind of different school of thought in the United States. So forgive me if I'm making assumptions. So the first is the role of capitalism as one of the foundations within which and against which the avant-garde emerges, subsists, and disappears. The second is the valorization of specific visual paradigms and their eventual dematerialization into mediatized forms, among them the monochrome, the ready-made, collage, photomontage, found object, and assemblage, as dominant to the lexicon of avant-gardism. While we may have surpassed the superficial aspects of the false comparison between pre- and post-war, these two ideological propositions have served as the groundwork and the point of departure for much of our research. Taken together, the overwhelming concern with the reproduction of capital and the transgressive possibilities of only a certain horizon of modernist visual forms has largely fostered avenues of analysis that have, for the most part, obscured the structures of fascism that are internal and integral to the historical context. Using Arjun Appadurai's terminology, how did the anxiety of incompleteness that animates fascism become equally formative in the post-war moment? According to Arjun Appadurai, the presence of minorities is a painful reminder to the majority of the small gap deficit that prevents them from attaining wholeness of an untainted national ethnos. As the Second World War made clear, this anxiety has the potential to turn into predatory violence and even genocide, as the majoritarian identity seeks to consolidate its power and purity. In many ways, while we have expanded the terrain of study, we're nevertheless continuing the transmission of a dominant modernist narrative that concerns itself with capitalism and visuality without attending, quite frequently, to the changed forms of governmentality. In other words, this is the time to start asking who has the right to be represented in this nation-state formation, and what are the strategies of visibility, erasure, and control that emerge in the visual arts and in contemporary art history. In seeking to examine how aesthetics and art histories produce certain iterations of the problem of Europe in collusion with capitalist forces, and how we historicize this contribution, we need to clarify the strategies through which the otherness of race, the otherness of the elsewhere, the otherness produced by borders, chief aspects of fascism and colonization were once folded into and eliminated from the social arena, and normativized or criticized by aesthetic strategies in different national contexts. Finally, although Europe has rhetorically gone through a process of repentance, self-critique, and deconstruction, the old continent, replaced by a multicultural world of global interactions, the structure of the nation-state is still alive and well when it comes to policing the constituency of Europe. Here, too, we can evoke the anxiety of incompleteness offered by Appadurai as an integral aspect of European identity, one that may have gone through a paradigm shift since the post-war, but that's still relevant for our understanding of cultural practices. In this context, and to conclude, we should be attentive to the ways in which art historical narratives that we're producing today participate in the process of imagining Europe by producing or erasing racial and ethnic categories, hierarchies, and segregations that strategically sustain capitalist expansion through the assertion of the nation-state. Thank you very much.
Dr Deborah Frizel, która jest wykładowczynią historii sztuki współczesnej, najnowszej na William Patterson University w New Jersey. Jest też kuratorką wystaw i przez szereg lat była dyrektorką Connecticut Gallery, a w latach 1990-95 kuratorką wystaw i programu edukacyjnego w New Britain Museum of American Art w Connecticut. Pani Deborah Frizel poświęciła szereg monografii artystkom amerykańskim, takim jak Ann Chernow czy Humphrey Spender, Misra Suciu, a obecnie pracuje nad monografią Nancy Sparrow, której twórczość teraz nam przedstawi.
Okay, good afternoon. First, I would like to thank all of the museum organizers here for organizing such a rich and varied conference. It's been quite an experience, I think, for all of us, and this is my first visit to Poland, so it's an enlightening experience for me as well. And I'd also like to thank my friend, Marek Bartolik, for inviting me as well. Okay, Nancy Spiro. Nancy Spiro produced a wide-ranging figurative oeuvre, including her image text scrolls and wall painting installations, which developed within the historical conditions of the American political and artistic left, especially the women's art movement and emergent feminism. Nevertheless, her full significance as an artist was often ghettoized by labeling and analyzing her work solely in feminist terms, as a means for isolating and so disregarding her artistic achievements during the dominance of the New York school and then the masculinist discourses of minimalism, conceptual art, and neo-expressionist movements. In a career that spanned 60 years, Spiro's radical image text conjunctions, her groundbreaking aesthetic approach, innovative graphic techniques and formats, and the political and feminist themes she pioneered inspired generations of younger artists such as Kiki Smith, Nalini Milani, Kara Walker, Shirin Nishat, and Shazia Sikander. Combining her cross-cultural hybrid figures with text fragments in her signature scroll works on paper and wall paintings, the artist engaged by transcription and metaphor, the extremes of human experience, from the horrific to the transcendent. Spiro changed the very terms in which we discuss painting. She allied her working processes and formats within an activist orientation and an ongoing questioning of the characteristics and formation of memory and representation, particularly the representation of women. Both her work and life argue for a socially dynamic, open-ended trajectory as an integral part of public discourse via aesthetic form, allowing for the possibility of redemptive encounters. She sought for her work to be recognized within the canon of art history, while seeking this recognition on her own terms in order to critique and subvert the privileged viewpoint. When Spiro and her artist colleagues opened the doors of the first Women's Cooperative Gallery in New York, AIR, or Artists in Residence, on September 16, 1972, with a membership of 22 women, Spiro was 46 years old at the time, already a mature artist who had been overshadowed in terms of recognition by her painter husband, Leon Golub. She was the mother of 3 sons, a fact which she also tried to keep hidden. It was Spiro's engagement in the ongoing dialogue with her AIR peers that was crucial to the construction of her artistic identity and to her work. Her long scroll works on paper were first shown at AIR Gallery between 1973 and 1981. Including Codex Artaud, shown in 1973, The Hours of the Night, shown in 1974 and owned by the Whitney Museum of American Art, Torture of Women, shown in 1976 and owned by the National Gallery of Canada, in Ottawa, Notes in Time on Women, shown in 1979 and owned by the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and The First Language, shown in 1981. All of these shown initially at AIR Gallery. During this intensely creative period, Spiro codified her hand-printed frieze format on paper and her encircling push-pinned horizontal format of her signature works. She bravely chose to focus solely on the female figure as protagonist, making significant contributions to the post-war art world. But it was not until 1987 that Spiro had her first retrospective exhibitions in the US, Canada, and Great Britain. As her traveling retrospective concluded in 1989 at the New Museum of Contemporary Art, then in Soho under the direction of Marcia Tucker, its founder, Spiro was 63 years old, a belated recognition due in part to Americanist prescriptive categories, ghettoizing not only feminist art, but also activist art and political art. These were always the categorizations into which Spiro was placed. But, excuse me, but Spiro's retrospective at the New Museum signaled a change in status and critical reception for her works. With art critics such as Michael Brenson and Roberto Smith writing significant reviews for the New York Times, and Thomas McEvely writing for Art Forum. And yet, even today, Spiro is egregiously absent from the Museum of Modern Art's 2010 supposedly groundbreaking publication, Modern Women, Women Artists at the Museum of Modern Art. Now, Spiro is not included in this newest publication, despite the fact that the museum owns Spiro's Notes in Time. This afternoon, I'd like to follow the bumpy trajectory of Spiro's layered and often paradoxical artistic career of marginalization and recognition in terms of her contributions to the development of modern and postmodern art. Nancy Spiro began her career in Chicago, where she grew up in a middle-class household in the suburbs. Her father, Henry Spiro, was born into a large family of German Jews, and her mother, Polly Susselman, was one of 6 siblings whose grandparents had emigrated from Russia. Henry Spiro was a successful businessman who owned and operated a company that purchased, repaired, and sold printing presses for the city's many newspapers and publishers. And we'll see that in the midpoint of Spiro's career, this association with printing press and letterpress becomes part of her working method, interestingly enough. After excelling in studio art classes at New Trier High School, a highly regarded and progressive public school, Spiro found her real milieu at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where she graduated with a BFA degree in 1949. Spiro's teachers included the Bauhaus-trained painter Paul Wiegert, who combined an affinity for both the School of Paris and German Expressionism. She studied with renowned printmaker Stanley William Hayter. Hayter was an artist of strong political and social convictions who enlisted his passionate graphic language in support of the Republican cause during the Spanish Civil War and other anti-fascist causes. Hayter wrote theoretical texts on automatism and expressive abstraction, and often collaborated with writers such as Samuel Beckett in seeking a contrapuntal dialogue between image and text, rejecting mere illustration. And of course, this factor is going to come into play in Spiro's work. Spiro's peers included June Leaf, Ellen Lanyon, and a young GI just returned from service in World War II, Leon Gala. Spiro and Gala became comrades in arms, united in their search for a resonant, new figurative expression, strong enough to communicate the profound traumas of a brutalized post-war world. Both artists looked to the examples of Jean de Buffet and Alberto Giacometti's figuration. While staying in New York for several months during the winter of 1951-52, Dubuffet visited Chicago, where a major exhibition of his work was mounted at the Chicago Arts Club. At the Arts Club, he delivered his iconoclastic speech, Anti-Cultural Positions, on December 20th, 1951, which was discussed at length within Spiro and Golub's circle. Both Spiro and Golub were familiar with Hans Prinzhorn's collection and his Artistry of the Mentally Ill, published in 1922 via art journals and magazines. Spiro had studied the work of earlier German and Austrian expressionists in the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago, especially the paintings and prints of Emil Nolde, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, Oskar Kokoschka, and Max Beckmann. In addition, Spiro and her peers felt an affinity for the work of certain surrealist artists such as Max Ernst, Joan Miro, and Mata. In addition, Spiro looked to Henri Michaud's use of automatic writing, his calligraphic ink drawings, which he entitled Exorcisms. Michaud's concept of drawing as handwriting, a spinning out of spontaneous responses in the process of uncovering raw primal emotion, informs Spiro's later image text conjunctions. After graduation, Spiro continued to study painting during a year in Paris at the École des Beaux-Arts and in the atelier of André Lode. In December 1951, soon after her return to the US, Spiro and Golub married and settled in Chicago, living and painting in a converted two-story garage. Both Spiro and Golub positioned the parameters of their work against the predominant tenets of Greenbergian modernism and the idiom of abstraction, allying their painting with the figurative expressionism emerging in Chicago, the Imagists. Spiro had local exhibitions of her painterly expressionist figure paintings in 1951, 52, and 53. While her first son, Stephen, was born in 1953, and her second son, Philip, was born in 1954. Through the sale of their paintings and a generous gift from a patron, Spiro and Golub were able to live in Italy from 1956 to 1957 while raising their two sons. Spiro painted at night after daytime excursions with the children and was able to get help caring for her sons, which was really crucial for her. It was in Florence and Ischia that Spiro became intrigued with the ancient and classical images of goddesses that would later inform her work. Finding a more artistically varied and receptive atmosphere for their figurative painting in Europe than in New York, in the New York art world that was dominated by the second generation abstract expressionism and pop art, Spiro and Golub left for Paris again in 1959. And I'm showing you a work of Leon's from this period. Now, they stayed in Paris for 5 years. Europe's burgeoning art movements manifested in a variety of approaches and philosophies such as Tagisme, Lettrism, Nouveau Realism, and Situationism. Spiro flourished in Paris. Their third son, Paul, was born there, and she had 3 major solo exhibitions at Galerie Berthaud in 1962, 64, and 68. During this prolific period, Spiro painted dark existentialist canvases in her series entitled Black Paintings, depicting sometimes mythic themes, sometimes mothers and children, embracing lovers, and hybrid human-animal gods and goddesses. Worked on at night, and over a period of several months, the figures and backgrounds of these monumental oils began as strokes and scumbles of mustard ochre, pink, or sienna. Scraped and often repainted with shades of black, The underpainting illuminates the darkness, suggesting a shifting movement in space. Instead of depicting light falling on the body's surfaces to define the underlying structure, Spiro scraped away at the surface to reveal an internal light, a fleeting luminescence. Precariously poised, outlined figures interlock in alternately tender or frenzied embrace, seesawing rhythmically, embodying fugitive emotions and an erotic charge, fading in and out of focus. In addition, the artist hung the black paintings unstretched like aging grafted skins, with white hospital tape outlining the canvases. As her paintings of mothers and children, the lovers are connected fleetingly, psychologically as well as physically. Spiro's figure compositions from this period suggest the experience of individual consciousness, emphasizing separate existential faiths, while at the same time, her conjoined figures merging with each other and their environment imply a sense of indivisible connections in spiritual or intimate relationships. Sexuality, phrased by the brushstrokes and undulating forms, is pictured as energy dispersed, evanescent and scattered in the luminous passages of figures melding into their background. The American poet John Ashbery wrote regularly about art in the journal Art International, and he reviewed Spiro's first exhibition in 1962 at Gallery Bertaux, describing her figures as at once, quote, monstrous and pathetic, evoking pathos and tenderness in a bitter poetry, end quote. Ashbery had recognized immediately in Spiro's figures an oscillating duality, a layering of oppositional emotions. And he pinpointed in Spiro a lyric, poetry, sensibility, which was anything but sentimental. In his discussion of technique, he highlighted the figure-ground relationships and the significance of a vast textured space. And I quote him again, "It is not the figures but their surrounding void which one retains. The transparent sooty depths, black flickering with pale blue and pink, are impressively painted," end quote. Spiro's tenebrous paintings also highlight her experiments with figuration, variations in contour, transparency, and luminescence in order to conjure up a visionary imagery. For Spiro, the phenomenological feel of physical space, as indivisibly woven with the conceptual, is a major organizing unit that inflects her figures. Returning to New York in 1964, Spiro found a very different America from the one she had left. The Vietnam War was raging, and the civil rights movement was rapidly gaining momentum. While the Black Panther Party had also emerged, both Spiro and Golub joined the Artisan Writers Protest Group, at once immersing themselves in anti-war projects as they settled with their family into a loft on the Lower East Side. After the Watts riots during August of 1965, Irving Petlin, a fellow artist friend and resident of Paris during the 1950s and a Chicago Images colleague, proposed building a collaborative anti-war project in the devastated neighborhood of Watts, the LA Peace Tower. In February 1966, a huge collaged LA Peace Tower rose as an international symbol of protest and outrage, with over 400 artists contributing artwork. Spiro's contribution was a painted image of a US military helicopter, a ubiquitous sight in newspaper photographs. And I'm not showing you the actual image. We don't have it any longer, but I'm showing you an image from her next series. The artist anthropomorphized the helicopter as a giant insect-like killing machine, consuming terrified and fleeing people. Spiro's war series, which he worked on from 1966 to 1970, was born of the LA Peace Tower. Affected by the horrific images broadcast nightly on television, Spiro painted startlingly immediate works with gouache and ink on paper, executed rapidly, linking the themes of sexuality, gender, racism, and the destruction of war. Combined with the scatological language of war and political speak of governments, she painted and collaged defecating phallic bombs, anthropomorphic helicopters pointing like forefingers to targets below, mutant humans spewing paroxysms of death and chaos. Spiro found a public voice in a pivotal form, pointing directly to political reality. Working in the less precious, sketchy medium of paper, Spiro declared an anti-heroic stance from the margins against the prevailing, commercially viable, deadpan idiom of pop art and the rigidity of minimalism's cool opacity and gestalt abstraction. Although Spiro had found an ostensibly broader public voice in the paper collage format, it was difficult for her to get this voice out into the public sphere, except in anti-war activist group exhibitions. And this is precisely where these war paintings were ghettoized, were boxed for many years until the 80s or the late 80s. In frustration, Spiro had joined the Art Workers Coalition in August 1968, an anti-war leftist group established to offer an alternative to established art institutions. But women were again marginalized and overlooked at AWAC. So in the fall of 1969, Spiro joined a radical splinter group, Women Artists in Revolution, or WAR, an anti-war group which also addressed the particular roles of women in society and culture, where Spiro regularly wrote pamphlets and appeared in panel discussions. At the Museum of Modern Art, WAR marched into director John Hightower's office and demanded parity for women artists. Spiro then joined the Ad Hoc Committee of Women Artists in 1970, organizing actions, sit-ins, and picketing the Whitney Museum of American Art. Spiro's participation in WAR, the Ad Hoc Women's Committee, consciousness-raising activities, and solidarity with her feminist peers gave her the confidence to pursue alternative venues and approaches. She understood the political and social conditions of women in and out of the art world. Spiro and her colleagues opened the first women's cooperative gallery, as I'd mentioned at the beginning, AIR Gallery in Soho, with the membership of 22 women artists. And again, I'm reminding you that Spiro was 46 years old at that time. So she was one of the two oldest artists in that group. And it was her engagement in this ongoing dialogue with an art community, and especially her AIR peers, that was crucial to the construction of her artistic identity and her work. So this is another thread that we pick up here in Spiro's work that ties into Adrian's points precisely. By 1971, Spiro had developed her pictographic language of gesture and motion in her signature scroll paintings. Although her collaged and painted scrolls were Homeric in both scope and depth as a feminist artist, she shunned the grandiose in content as well as style, relying instead on intimacy and immediacy. in order to reveal the historical continuum of politically repressive strategies underlying enduring patriarchal mythologies, Spiro methodically researched history and ancient mythology. She was determined to represent previously obscured women's histories, to question dominant cultural mythologies and stereotypes, to trace literary references to women's political and social conditions via her expressive figuration. Having both the camaraderie and the open physical space of AIR Gallery as a public venue, Spiro was able to take over the gallery space for her solo exhibitions, to unfurl her scrolls as she wished, push-pinning her new work, Codex Artaud, continuously around the four walls of the gallery in 1973. In 1969, Spiro had discovered an appropriate voice through which to channel her personal and political anger, ventriloquizing the fractured, excoriating texts of the creator of the Theater of Cruelty, Antonin Artaud. By building a contemporary apocalyptic language via expressive contorted figures and fragmented texts, fragments of Artaud's texts, Spiro moved past the specific subject matter of the war series to expand her pictorial language. Spiro's breakthrough idiosyncratic adaptation of Artaud's fractured texts within collaged word and image sign systems highlighted the disjunctions and inadequacies of language itself, especially within habituated syntactic forms. The marginalized artist's angry persona, gesticulating in Codex Artaud, and you're just seeing one fragment of it, the long spliced scroll format embodied an epic scale and employed a visual poetics as structure, interweaving stylized figures and fragmented, torn, and typed collage. In Codex Artaud, 196 inches long, consisting of 32 paper panels glued end to end, Spiro printed, collaged, and hand-stamped images of varying scale, interwoven with slices of text, typed on an array of different typewriters, including a large bulletin typewriter. She fragmented and tore, spun and clotted Artaud's lines, sometimes overtyping sentences into incomprehensibility, forming abstract patterns of concrete poetry, while interlocking her figures drawn from prehistoric and classical myth with contemporary media, thus mingling historical timeframes. Spiro incorporated into this mix signs and symbols, the poetic caesuras of white space, which appeared both flat and infinite, encompassing silence and implying an unalterable isolation. By employing this encircling format, pushpin continuously around several walls at eye level, Spiro constructed a non-linear compendium which the viewer could enter into at any point. Her scroll violated the normative scale of modernist painting, valued materials and the formal arrangement of discrete framed paintings in museum and gallery displays. With this gesture outward into real space, Spiro developed a counter-modernist strategy, devaluing the hierarchy of art objects, deploying instead a borderless image surface to wall surface, interacting and straining with the properties, cadence, and shape of the surrounding space. In 1973, the critic Lawrence Alloway identified Spiro's unique discursive language in Codex Artaud as, quote, a remarkable compound of two sign systems in which the verbal text and visual interpenetrate, end quote. Alloway discussed the normative linear form of writing as progressing sequentially in time, while the normative pictorial form of drawing expanded spatially. In addition, Spiro recognized in Artaud's writing a sensibility harnessed by an urgent attempt to communicate extreme physical and psychological pain. Later in life, Spiro admitted that at the time of composing Codex Artaud, she was suffering from the cumulative effects of almost 10 years of rheumatoid arthritis. Her pain was constant and her hands were crippling up. The artist understood that Artaud's expressive language merged metaphysical anxiety and acute physical distress, offering her a means to transform personal anger and suffering into a broadly resonating poetics, recording the passing of a living force from one level to another level. In 1975, she was transferring her drawings to metal plates, adding the letterpress process to her other techniques. So she's interestingly and really unconsciously, going back to her father's factory space. Within this method, Spiro shifted the repetitive means of doubling an image via letterpress regularity by undermining this regularity in hand printing, emphasizing the endless variations of pressure, inking, and papers. At the start of 1974, Spiro chose to depict only women in order to conceptually shift the universal representation of mankind from the predominant male subject to the female subject, whose representation had been cast in binary opposition as the eternal other. Spiro had read, reread, and annotated in her 1954 edition of Simone de Beauvoir's, quote, dispersed, contingent, and multiple existences of actual women, end quote. Thus, Spiro's scrolls, shown at AIR Gallery between 1973 and 81, included Codex Artaud, The Hours of the Night and Torture in Chile, Torture of Women, Notes in Time on Women, and The First Language. In horizontal scrolls, such as The First Language, which Spiro worked on from 79 to 81, over 190 feet long, the artist performed a poetic reconstruction of the diversity of representations of women from the ancient to the contemporary world, validating multiple subjectivities of female experience and establishing female pleasure, female desire as a feminist subject. Snatching figures from a wide range of sources, ancient mythology, mass media, art history, and literature, she repainted, cut, and reworked the figures within new contexts. Here the artist jettisoned text entirely to examine the full range of expressive possibility and eloquence of figures in relationship to each other and to the scroll space, realizing a dynamic hieroglyphic language, a word that Spiro often used herself, her hieroglyphics. With a newly found optimism spurred by her scroll's integration in the architectural space of AIR and her exchanges and dialogue with colleagues from the gallery, Spiro honed a choreography of the body in motion and in relationship to the scroll space and to time as duration, developing a cinematographic quality. Spiro historicized herself as an artist in 1983 when she organized 3 simultaneous solo gallery exhibitions in nonprofit spaces in New York City, covering a full range of her work to date. Her War series and her then recent Artemis scrolls from 1983, which she exhibited at Gallery 345, Art for Social Change, Inc. And then her Black Paintings Paris and her Codex Artaud at AIR Gallery, and simultaneously her new paintings that is scroll paintings from 1979 to 83 at Art Galaxy. This retrospective view gave Sparrow the opportunity to take stock of her figurative lexicon and expand the audience's understanding of her oeuvre. But while women had made headway in representation within art institutions during a period when figurative painting was supposedly making a comeback, it was the neo-expressionist artists, especially the young male German and Italian artists, who dominated the art world spotlight and critical discourse in New York. During the 1980s, the neo-expressionist persona was embodied by a macho male stance in sync with the social backlash of Reagan-era conservatism. Lucy Lepard, an early supporter of Sparrow's work, wrote of the artist's significant differences from the young male artists of this period in aesthetic, political, and moral terms, and I quote Lepard. She, that is Sparrow, emerges at this particular moment as both the precursor and vivid contemporary of the shouting, spitting, shitting neo-expressionism now in vogue. With one difference, Sparrow cares. Her mythical imagery is rooted in decades of political activism, as well as in an aesthetic far fresher and more disturbing than that of her reactionary peers, end quote. At the time, Sparrow was never clearer about her direction as an artist, working in opposition to prevailing social constructs and aesthetic norms. She operated from the margins, but asked key questions about pictorial representation and tackled the most challenging problems of socially engaged art. British art historian and critic Michael Newman reviewed Sparrow's simultaneous solo shows and made note of her positioning for Art Monthly. And I quote Newman, that Sparrow's major works of the last 12 years all take the form of installation is an important context of feminist art which dispenses with the monumentality and competitive assertiveness of large-scale painting, for it allows the artist to assume control of the conditions under which the work is seen and break down the hierarchy of fine art and decoration, end quote. It was in 1987 that Sparrow's unique achievements were finally recognized with retrospective museum exhibitions in Great Britain, the US, and Canada. British art historian and theorist John Bird curated the Sparrow retrospective at the Institute for Contemporary Art in London, which then traveled to the Fruit Market Gallery in Edinburgh, the Orchard Gallery in Derry, Northern Ireland. In the US, Robert Storr curated Nancy Sparrow work since 1950 at the Everson Museum of Art, Syracuse, New York, which then traveled to the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, the Mendel Gallery in Saskatchewan, Canada, the List Visual Arts Center at MIT Cambridge, the Power Plant in Toronto, Ontario, and the final destination in 1989, the New Museum of Contemporary Art in New York. Sparrow's retrospective destination at the New Museum of Contemporary Art in New York signaled a change of status and critical reception for the artist's work. Her own philosophy, political activism, and artistic structuring dovetailed with the museum's parallel qualities championed by Marcia Tucker and staff. Sparrow directed her crew on site to print colorful, stray, relief-like Sheila Nagigs, which you see on the screen. You see a sculptural Sheila Nagig. There were also hand-printed Sheila Nagigs. She printed these under the museum's clerestory windows and on crisply defined lintels corresponding to Sheila Nigig's traditional placement, presiding over all and warding off evil. Silhouetted and tattooed Aboriginal and African tribal figures combined with Greek vase dildo dancers and Egyptian sky goddesses slithered up the smooth classical columns, refusing to become classically proportioned caryatids bearing the load. Instead, the diagonally charging figures appeared to put the columns into a spin. Spiro's figure's spasmodic, decidedly centrifugal motion outwards exploited threshold spaces. They highlighted transitions, that is, margins, doorways, corners, arches, ceilings, niches, beams, nether spaces at the edge of disappearance, the threshold between the real and the imaginary. Symbolic of beginnings, endings, and rebirth, these thresholds present the possibilities of the void. And as Spiro herself once remarked, quote, the ease and violence of passage between the natural and the supernatural. Hereafter, Spiro sometimes jettisoned the picture plane of her scrolls, moving her images directly onto the walls of museums and public spaces in order to rewrite the representational forms of women through historical time, thereby engaging in a dialogue with architectural spaces and their histories, and often with recontextualized museum objects. Spiro's bodily hieroglyphs were printed with rubber stamps and then later polymer plates by her crew of assistants, closely orchestrated by the artist, enacting a controlled sense of chance on walls and ceilings, pedestals and columns, air ducts and beams, so that many, many final decisions were made on site of Spiro in dialogue with her assistants, sometimes in dialogue with museum staff, a number of different kinds of dialogues that occurred. And remember, this is a period when Spiro cannot readily draw or paint, so she becomes an orchestrator and a kind of choreographer. Spiro's repertory-like cast of characters, or paper dolls, which he called them, survey and critique representational styles and notions of embedded meanings with images. Spiro's multiple sources for her subtly differentiated and recycled images, not originated by the artist's hand in a single process, upset the tenets of authorship. This anti-hierarchical and unpredictable approach floated a matrix of layered correspondences across time and space, whose meanings were left open-ended and whose vectors could go in any direction. In addition, the ephemerality of these installations underscored Spiro's critique of the notions of the permanence and preciousness of discrete objects, disrupting the museum's ultimate mission to house and preserve art objects. Mark making directly on walls connotes marginalized or even childish paroxysms of trespass, graffiti, and random contorted articulations from the street. The exotic or obscene may enter via margins, walls, and alleyways. Spiro's provocations and reimaginings of female sexuality and desire found a new symbolic resonance by moving onto the walls for public scrutiny. expressively challenging the dominant masculinist mythologies represented canonically by Willem de Kooning's high modernist women paintings from 1950 to 52, and Andy Warhol's arch send-ups of macho action painters in his Piss paintings from 1952, or the oxidation paintings. Spiro began spreading and dispersing her women protagonists directly onto the walls, displaying a different kind of erotic trespass, a feminist subversion epitomized by her Sheilas, dildo dancers, and sky goddesses. By fragmenting and condensing multiple time frames and juxtaposing schematic figures of differing scale and historical eras, the artist examined the themes of witness and commemoration, as well as collective and individual memory, fortified by the expressive potential of moving the figure-ground relationship from her early discrete paintings to scrolls and then to wall painting. Spiro could literally step out into the public arena while expanding a symbolic language of poetic structure and motion, commentary, and analysis. Her figure's transformation within different contexts meant that relationships were always crucial, and this is, I think, one of the major themes that continues throughout Spiro's entire oeuvre. Relationships are always crucial, and another speaker had mentioned tarot cards, and although I wasn't able to discuss those here, and others have discussed Spiro's deep relationship to analyzing the tarot card figures. Of course, when using tarot cards, it's the relationship which changes the meaning of various readings. So those relationships are crucial. Okay. Critic Thomas McEvely, writing in Art Forum of Spiro's conceptual and formal contributions in 1988, that is during her retrospectives in the US and Canada and Great Britain, he writes, and I quote him, "This strange intellectuality of Spiro's oeuvre, combined with its sensitive visual experimentation, its social activism alongside its delicate incorporation of linguistic elements into design, make this exhibition a kind of model of much that the aesthetic of the 1970s has left us of enduring value," end quote. Village Voice critic Kim Levin ironically entitled her review of Spiro's retrospective, "Mastery Exposed." Levin pointed to Spiro's defiance of formalist assumptions, her violation or inversion of the axioms of dominant styles, her refusal of the rectangle as support framework, her rejection of centrality and oftentimes of color, and finally her refusal of the center-edge dichotomy and closed meaning. She emphasized that Spiro had appropriated images and texts, worked with ideas of mechanical reproduction and historical feminist writings before the popularization of texts by Walter Benjamin and Julia Kristeva, after they had become popularized references for artists and theoreticians during the 1980s. Most important, Levin positions Spiro's artistic invention as prescient of movements touted in the high-powered commercial galleries of the 1980s, especially neo-expressionism. And I quote Kim Levin here. "Her references to Artaud have been joined by Schnabels. Her depictions of mouths that spew tiny heads by Clementes. Her stick figures by Penix, her alienated females by Appelbrooks, her printed cutouts by Taffas," end quote. In 1988, Spiro painted her first temporary full-fledged wall installations, Two Soar at the Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art and Waterworks at the Filtration Gallery in the R.C. Harris Water Filtration Plant, Toronto. Spiro continued to explore the possibilities of scrolls, hand-printed collages, and wall painting installations throughout the 1990s until shortly before her death in October of 2009. She orchestrated over 24 wall painting installations, both ephemeral and permanent, while she expanded her so-called cast of characters, her repertoire, to over 500 strong. And I'll end just with a note here. I'm skipping one of her wall painting installations in Hellerau, Dresden, the Ballad of Marie Sanders, the Jew's Whore. Spiro's gendered themes explored the full range of power relations, unraveling the political in a manifestation of individual histories and tracing the psychotopography of individual memory and collective witness. She consistently enlivened socially engaged figurative art, valuing subtext and layering socio-political meanings manifest in an aesthetic commitment to experimentation with image text and figure ground conjunctions, allied with collage and printmaking techniques, in order to rejuvenate visual dialogues within a variety of public contexts. Thank you.
I think we have a lot of things to discuss now, but at the same time, probably we are a bit tired. So I hope it will not be a very long discussion. Well, I think there is in all three papers the common issue, which is crucial for the topic of this conference concerning lost avant-garde. What are the conditions or mechanism, political, geographical, and theoretical also, mechanism of inclusion and exclusion, of recognition and misrecognition, which was clearly presented by Deborah in relation to Nancy Spiro, who was recognized more broadly only after the appearance of Neue Wilde and Italian trans avant-garde. And also in case of Leopoldo Haar, for example, in Poland, nobody almost knows about him as an artist, despite the fact that he lived and he worked for some time in this place in Łódź. And this is a good example of this kind of exclusion that was conditioned by the national frame of art history in Europe and as well in Americas. I will start with one question to Nui. The more optimistic point in your speech especially was that this possibility of creative transformation of exile and modernism of exile, not modernism in exile, but of exile. And I have a question, do you understand this term, modernism of exile, as a personal thing, a personal kind of taking position, or is it something wider which is related to this more structural condition which was clearly visible with the shift of many European artists and intellectuals to the West, to South America, to Latin America, to North America during the war?
Can I just ask for clarification when you say personal, because personal is structural. So what do you mean by personal?
I mean, do you understand it as something that is related only to individual fates of some artists, or is it something broader that describes a certain period or something like that?
Well, I would like to turn this into a theory. Otherwise, it's of no use. Yeah, I think it's a useful mechanism through which to complicate a kind of binary of center and periphery by thinking about a triangulation or an interstitiality, which is a theoretical motor based on a structural condition. But even within that kind of model, then there needs to be further differentiation. Otherwise, it's too broad, right? So if we establish a theory, which is a modernism of exile, then it allows us for further clarifications within it. But I think it needs to be, I mean, the thing is, one could say that it has been developed in some sense in literature, right? Literature is not without a kind of notion of exile. I think there's a kind of belatedness in art history to break through the dominance of a certain high modernism that hasn't been able to entertain this kind of interstitiality for some reason, and has gone between center and periphery. So I think we need to develop a theory that is structural, and then be able to nuance it and refine it.
Yes, probably it was better developed by philosophers like Deleuze, who writing about minor literatures, and this condition which you showed with presenting the work of Gertrude Goldschmidt, of being in a language which is not really your own. Deleuze has written about writing in a language which is not really your own, which is also which can be turned into a new creative impulse and a kind of revolution in this foreign language.
Absolutely, I think you're right, yeah.
Well,
I have a question well, you mentioned in your lecture on gecko, I think a relatively important issue which we didn't touch in our previous speeches in this two days conference. I think and I would like to ask certain questions, because some issues concerning, I want to go back to Żarnower and to some details. You mentioned this division to Western Jews and so-called Eastern Jews. I had really difficult conversations in the Jewish Museum a couple of times with Norman Kleeblatt, the chief curator of Jewish Museum, and with Stephen Brown, who were not interested in Żarnower at all, explaining that she's an example of so-called Eastern Jew, and that's why the Jewish Museum is not really diving into this artifacts, etc., etc. So that's one issue. The other one is the ghetto memorial, the ghetto memorial, which was supposed to be built in the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial, which was supposed to be built on the west side in a park. The space for this memorial was picked up and is mentioned, is notified even till now. And może ja przejdę, przepraszam, przechodzę na polski. I ten relief dotyczący powstania w getcie warszawskim, który wiemy z różnych z zapisków w końcu żydowskich organizacji, bo to wszystko, co znalazłam, było w archiwach IWO i w archiwach Hajasu, że ta rzeźba Żarnower, która była pokazana w Wydziale Sztuki Nowoczesnej na wystawie ważnej, bardzo ważnej, bo wystawie inaugurującej Muzeum Żydowskie, że ta wystawa i ta rzeźba cieszyły się bardzo dużym zainteresowaniem. Więcej, w korespondencji Dawida Żarnowera z Andrzejem Turowskim, to jest korespondencja z lat 60., ten Dawid jest absolutnie przekonany, że ta rzeźba trafiła do Muzeum Żydowskiego. Prawdopodobnie była jakaś korespondencja między Żarnower a bratem, po czym okazuje się, że nie dość, że tej rzeźby muzeum nie chce, to potem, kiedy jest duża publiczna debata dotycząca tego upamiętnienia powstania w getcie warszawskim na zachodniej części, w parku po zachodniej części miasta, to nagle okazuje się, że zaproszeni do zrobienia projektu, do zrobienia propozycji, bo to trwa długo, to trwa ileś lat, ma nawet wystawę projektów w MoMA, są tylko mężczyźni artyści. Jest artysta pochodzenia i amerykańskiego, i holenderskiego, natomiast do Żarnower nie zwraca się nikt, a ten cały projekt zaczyna się jeszcze w 1948 roku. I ciekawa jestem, czy właśnie w związku z tymi wykluczeniami, o których była mowa w tym ostatnim bloku tematycznym, czy pani mogłyby się do tego jakoś ustosunkować i mogłyby znaleźć jakiś klucz, bo mnie klucza właściwie, ja widzę, że coś mi się tu kupy nie trzyma, ale ciągle nie mam do tego klucza. Dziękuję.
May I ask for clarification? Is there a relationship between the Jewish Museum and the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial, or are these two separate questions?
To są dwa różne pytania, ale niezupełnie, ponieważ w Jewish Museum na wystawie inaugurującej, czyli tej pierwszej wielkiej wystawie, która trwała prawie rok, Żarnower w dziale sztuki nowoczesnej, bo to była wystawa w wystawie. Żarnower pokazała relief dotyczący powstania w getcie warszawskim. I z zapisków, które udało mi się znaleźć w Hajasie i w IWO, wiem, że ta wystawa miała ogromną publiczność. Wiem, że ta wystawa była świetnie opisywana i wiem, że duża ilość publiczności była bardzo zainteresowana tym reliefem. To jest jedno. Moje rozmowy z Jewish Museum, bo ja bardzo długo usiłowałam znaleźć ślad, że ta praca w ogóle była w Jewish Museum. I tylko i wyłącznie wiem to z listu Żarnower, natomiast w Jewish Museum jest nazwisko Teresy Żarnower, natomiast nie ma wymienionej pracy. Ja przeszłam przez rozmowy włącznie z badaczem, który bada archiwalia Jewish Theological Seminary i przejrzałam całe archiwa Stevena Kaisera, który był kuratorem tej wystawy. I tam nie ma nic na temat, jaką pracę pokazuje Żarnower. Potem jeszcze, kiedy po wielu latach od tamtej wystawy rozmawiałam, no teraz kiedy szukałam materiałów o Żarnower, rozmawiałam z kuratorami Muzeum Żydowskiego, no to wtedy właśnie oni mi powiedzieli, ale to jest sprawa pewnie późniejsza. I to jest jedno pytanie. Drugie pytanie to jest to, że w tym samym czasie jest jeszcze do zobaczenia w Muzeum Żydowskim ten relief dotyczący powstania warszawskiego, powstania Żydów w Warszawie, powstania w getcie warszawskim i w tym samym czasie powstaje inicjatywa zbudowania pomnika, stałego pomnika w parku w Nowym Jorku, gdzieś na wysokości zachodniej 83. I nikt się nie zwraca do Żarnower z propozycją.
In what year?
There are informations about it in New York Times from 48 till 51.
Well, maybe Serge knows the history of the Jewish Museum in relationship to New York better than I do, but as far as I know the little bit of history about the Jewish Museum, it was an extremely avant-garde space until throughout the 60s, with the primary structures show in 1966, the first Yves Klein kind of avant-garde show in 1967, 1968. So it was actually, its mission was to connect with the avant-garde and kind of modernist history. It only became a kind of kitsch Judaica, let's say, monument later on, and is only now reintegrating it into a kind of global market by bringing in Jens Hoffmann as the director, by kind of staking itself out within the kind of sexy business of brands and objects. But I as far as I know, in the 60s, its mission was to actually support modernism and an avant-garde. And the question of a Jewish artist, I have never been in the archives to investigate this. It seems like you've done quite a bit of work, but I think it would have been perhaps at a dissonance or contradiction with its mission. But no, someone's. Okay, well, there you go. We have people who've done research on the Jewish Museum. I haven't.
I spoke with Norman on Monday before I came here.
Fantastic.
I asked the same question that you've been asking for quite a while, and Norman's answer was very clear. There won't be any public for this kind of work. And we care about the public nowadays, so that's our criterion. So the whole issue of where the Jews came from and who is behind the Jewish Museum, it's a historical question, but nowadays that's not a question even, because the question is whether this exhibition will generate any interest. And according to Norman, it will not, therefore they cannot commit themselves to doing that kind of show. Ja tylko powtarzam to, co Norman powiedział. Czy to jest trudne pytanie? Pewnie jest trudne pytanie, tak. A inne?
Ja też zadałam pytanie Normanowi, czy wystawa Żarnower byłaby dla nich interesująca. I on powiedział, że w tej chwili praktyka muzeum. Ja zadałam to pytanie Normanowi 2 lata temu i wtedy, kiedy akurat tam się pojawił ten nowy sexy, trendy dyrektor, który miał zrobić z tego taki hotspot w Nowym Jorku. W związku z czym tam w ogóle był popłoch pomiędzy kuratorami. Oni nie wiedzieli, kto się utrzyma, kto zostanie, ponieważ cała struktura miała być zmieniona. Natomiast ja nie pytałam w kontekście dziś, bo to było dla mnie jasne, że oni tego nie. Natomiast oni w tych rozmowach i wtedy, kiedy ja robiłam te jakieś poszukiwania i usiłowałam czegokolwiek się dowiedzieć, przede wszystkim usiłowałam znaleźć śladów tego reliefu, no bo był i nie ma. Potem się dowiedziałam, że Abramowiczowie w 60-tych latach, ponieważ to wróciło do niej do pracowni i było duże i oni usiłowali to sprzedać, usiłowali to podarować Muzeum Żydowskiemu w latach 60. I muzeum tego nie chciało. W związku z czym oni to zniszczyli. Zrobili jedno porządne zdjęcie i zniszczyli. Natomiast rzeczywiście ten relief wrócił do pracowni i z tej pracowni po śmierci Żarnower był przejęty przez rodzinę Abramowiczów. Nikt nie chciał.
Ale
wtedy mi powiedział Norman, że to jest kwestia tego, że są Western Jews, Eastern Jews i to, co jeżeli to byłoby niemieckiego Żyda, to by było ciekawe. A jeżeli to było Żyda ze wschodu, no to wiadomo, że to dziki Żyd. No,
tak, ale wydaje mi się, że to jest ciekawe to, co pani mówi, z tym, że w jakimś sensie odnosi się, nie odnosi do tego, czym była dyskusja, prawda? Bo, tak. To znaczy tylko, żeby umieścić tą Gego w kontekście jej rozmowy na temat jej self-identyfikacji, natomiast co mnie interesuje w twojej prezentacji, to jest to, że ty troszeczkę odkręcasz drugą stronę, czyli posyłasz to pytanie z powrotem, zamiast je ciągle właśnie posyłać do Nowego Jorku, to teraz to pytanie wraca do nas. I to jest pytanie nie tylko o to, co się stało z Żarnower, ale tak jak my tą Żarnower teraz przedstawiamy. I myślę, że to jest bardzo ciekawe pytanie i takie chyba porządkujące tą naszą dyskusję, która jest raczej archiwistyczno detektywistyczna, natomiast tutaj jest, ja myślę, że to w pewnym sensie też twój trening nie wiem, z Saidem, prawda, który jak gdyby to pytanie zadaje o samą metodę badawczą, prawda, i o to, kim jest ta osoba, która bada, prawda, że to jest bardzo ważne, że to tworzymy jak gdyby świadomość nie tylko przez to, że przyglądamy się dziełu, ale przyglądamy się sobie samemu, czyli tej osobie interpretatora, prawda, czy tekstowi, który akurat u Ciebie się bardzo wyraźnie pojawia w tym tekście. Ja myślę, że dla mnie ta rozmowa jest o tyle ciekawa, że ona w pewnym sensie właśnie jest takim futuryzmem detektywa, że my sobie moglibyśmy wyobrazić na przykład Żarnower, która gdyby dłużej żyła, czy by została Giego, czy by została Nancy Spiro na przykład. Twój temat jest o tyle ciekawy, ja tylko jedną rzecz sobie uświadomiłem, że bo Żarnower jest umieszczona w takim nawiasie dwóch mężczyzn, którzy są tym się wyróżniają, że są żydowskiego pochodzenia i obaj znaleźli się w Brazylii. Można ten nawias rozszerzyć, prawda, bo jest Heiga Ostrower, prawda, która też pojechała do Brazylii, prawda, kobieta, która też zaistniała w tym środowisku. Dla mnie jest jeszcze ciekawsza sama historia Adama Zamojskiego, który pojechał do Brazylii też. Otworzył tam szkołę, prawda, czyli jest to ten artysta awangardy polskiej, nie tej konstruktywistycznej, ale jest on jak gdyby bliżej Żarnower niż Segal na przykład, albo Har, prawda, którzy są w pewnym sensie tylko się identyfikują przez to, że wyjeżdżają z Polski. Więc może by było jeszcze dobrze, żeby dodatkowo poszerzyć o te pierwiastki tych ludzi, którzy w jakiś sposób tę awangardę definiowali. Ci ludzie wyjechali w zasadzie, ich związek z awangardą jest dosyć fragmentaryczny, można powiedzieć najlepiej. Bo Zamojskiego historia jest bardzo ciekawa, prawda? On otworzył szkołę i w São Paulo, i w Rio, i w zasadzie uczył pokolenia Brazylijczyków, jak rzeźbić, prawda? Wyrzeźbił to on chyba wyrzeźbił tego strasznego Chopina na plaży w Copacabana.
No, I think this is a really interesting question. Actually, in my other work, I've traced this sort of São Paulo-Rio split, which is a big methodological and sort of a mythology of a big divide there. And I've actually traced it to a pedagogical roots in Rio. Had much more of a French influence, whereas São Paulo, there were many more immigrants from Eastern and Central Europe. And so I argue in my larger work connected to this project that it is exactly through pedagogues who taught the generation that Leopoldo Har joined in São Paulo in the post-war period that kind of lineage comes through. But I also wanted to connect this back to what Milada was saying and the Gego question, and this also connects to Nancy Sparrow, because I understand your point about the detective, the archival work, but I think what we're all butting our heads against or somehow dealing with as well is the museological definitions, because I think a lot of what I'm dealing with, and with Nancy Sparrow, and certainly with Gego, those exhibitions, she became famous as a Latin American artist. And so I think thinking about us as detectives is one lens, but I'm very interested in how sort of curatorship and the museum and the institution are defining these artists and positioning them as well.
But in this case, we have to look differently at Peggy Guggenheim.
Certainly.
You cannot just sort of valorize the space as sort of a space of recognition. It's much more complicated, and the fact that she is pushed to the front, and I mean, there is a lot of kind of discussion about the configuration of the space itself, right? And then how she fits into that space. And
certainly, and I wanted to ask a specific question because you kind of like made a very quick mention at the beginning of something about the sort of Venezuelan government and modernity and the sort of stakes of accepting immigrants from Europe in the immediate post-war. And I was curious if you could elaborate on that.
Sure. Well, I made a quick reference to the way that Gego became institutionalized as Venezuelan and Latin America through the politics of post-1948 in Venezuela, which brought in a government that depended on the oil boom or exploited the oil boom, and also a kind of agenda of modernization to inscribe itself as a political center, if you will, a cultural center, and therefore gave immense cultural sponsorship to artists who could participate in that project, including Villanueva, for example, the building of the university by Villanueva, and many of the kinetic artists, such as Cruz Diaz and etc., Soto, who went, very dramatically from 48 to, at the moment of 48, from producing these kind of indigenous representations to all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but it seemed very punctual, at least in the museological literature, to this kind of abstract language. So there's, what I'm pointing to is the kind of local power dynamics through which Gego would become embraced as a Venezuelan artist, but in order for that to happen, her difference, her cultural, gender, ethnic, racial difference had to be erased, because
I actually disagree, because I think part of the sort of appeal of, at least at the beginning of her career, of artists like Gego was precisely their Europeanness for a government that's trying to achieve this modernity, encouraging immigration or accepting artists in this way, institutionalizing them. There is a way in which I think you're exactly right. Over her career, that kind of Germanness has been erased to kind of naturalize her as a Venezuelan. But I think at the beginning, part of this sort of valorization of her is precisely as a German.
Yes and no, because she doesn't get citizenship until 1952. So she's basically suspended as a stateless subject from the late 30s to 52. There isn't a kind of embrace of the newly arrived immigrant. She's in a holding pattern, and only after 48.
After 48, exactly.
No, but not even 48. It takes till 52. It takes almost to the kind of it takes actually to the moment also of a kind of North American kind of secondary colonization, if, or the insertion within a North American hemisphere kind of narrative of abstraction, for this to reflect back onto the Venezuelan story, which is still being created, and for that at that moment for her to enter.
But do you think it's North American? Because I think, as Serge mentioned this morning, I think the French axis is incredibly important. I mean, a bunch of the other Venezuelans are going to France, not in 48, so many, but certainly by the 50s, it's really this kind of French axis. And North America, I think, pops up much later.
I don't think for Gego. I don't know where she stands in relationship. I haven't studied her relationship to Soto or to Carlos Cruz Diaz. I am not exactly sure where she stands in relationship to them. I think that's an elaboration of this would be necessary. But for her, there is no return to Europe. And her first exhibition in Europe is actually in Germany last year, which is kind of amazing. So for Gego, again, this is to basically particularize the theory. It's not the European lens or the European institutional lens, it's the North American institutional lens, as far as I understand it.
So maybe it's a good moment to ask Debbie how you feel that Nancy fits into that sort of conversation with her identity beyond just being a woman, because that was the strongest point in your argument, but her Jewishness, the fact that she comes from Chicago, if she is Jewish, her roots extend into Europe. How does she perceive those sort of those relationships?
Yeah, well, both she and Leon were very acutely aware that Chicago was the second city, second fiddle to New York, and that they eventually had to settle in New York and deal with all of the American prescriptive categories. And in terms of her Jewishness, this is a very interesting question, because she hardly mentioned the fact of her Jewishness at the beginning of her career. And then there was a turning point, and I think the turning point came sometime in the mid-1980s, when she was asked, when she was commissioned to do a work, do works in several locations in Europe, in Germany, in Austria, in which she began to do research, not particularly within to do any genealogy within her own family, but she began to do research. For example, her project in Hellerau. She spent months and months speaking with the director and the curators and doing archival research. And so gradually, it was a gradual process to bring that part of her identity to the fore. So again, it's a process of kind of gradually, I think, feeling comfortable within the art world, gaining confidence. Before that, she was I think, leery of being put into another box. Oh, you're a Jewish artist. She was already in the woman box. So that came after this degree of confidence and research and being able actually to travel to some of these temporary and permanent sites. She made a permanent installation, for example, in Salzburg, of all places, in a military hospital. And part of her Hellerau project is preserved. Suzanne Altman had a great deal to do with the preservation of her work there. So it's, I guess it's like any other piece of your identity. You deal with what you can deal with in a particular within a particular context and within yourself. And the third point I think here is also that Nancy felt such a great affinity for a number of French artists, a number of European artists, the German expressionists, and so she was very, very attracted to going back. She spent a great deal of time absorbing the culture. Her French was more or less fluent, so the European roots of modernism were very important to her, but then that was a wall against which she could sort of bounce this Americanness. So I think it's always, or it seemed to be with Spiro, always finding finding a wall to bump up against, and if that answers.
I just want to add something to my response. So 1955 is the Movement exhibition in Paris that has Carlos Cruz Diaz, and in 59 it's her kind of being purchased by MoMA. But one of the reasons, actually, I wanted to add why she also looked to the Northern Hemisphere is because her family had gotten visas to England, and from England they got U.S. citizenship. So it was also a reason for her to keep in touch with her family by going to the Northern Hemisphere, just as a kind of detail. But
it's just that for most Latin American art centers, strangely maybe to North American eyes, the Paris remained very important, long past the point that you would sort of expect New York to take that role. And so I was just curious because
I think for Gego, because she was also trained as an architect, there was and because there was so much money going into architectural production in Latin America, in Caracas, she wanted to work. and this was a way to work also.
But I think you say it's a right kind of question, because in a way I did my research on Osvaldo Vigas, who is one of the artists who also went to Paris in the 50s, right? And in Paris, actually, there were two groups. There was the group, the geometric group, Soto and so on, who were kind of related to the gallery Denis René, but there were the figurative artists who actually allied themselves with Fredo Lam in some way. And so the tension sort of grew in Paris, and then it resonated back in Venezuela, and Osvaldo Vigas went back after 10 years in Paris. He went back to Caracas and tried to sort of, you know, did the murals for the university place. And so it's true that Paris, actually going back to Serge's presentation this morning, that it was important in a way because it set stage for a lot of debates that happened a little bit later, because Gego is really not the same. I mean, age-wise, she sort of could be the same, but in terms of how she enters the conversation, she's a little bit later, right, I think. If I understand well. With her, I want to say one thing, because you know, I was a little bit doing my research at one time, and I was, like you, surprised that there was these two brothers who came to Brazil quite late, because they came in the 1930s. Most of those people came, or 40s, most of those people, they came in the 20s or even before. Right, but what's interesting that they went first. They didn't go to São Paulo. Actually, they were in the Polish kind of part of Brazil, right? Mm-hmm. So their movement was interesting, because they went to Curitiba, right? They went to Porto Alegre, yeah. And then from there they sort of ventured into São Paulo, which is also an interesting kind of road, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, they had a salon down in Porto Alegre, which was known as the kind of hotbed for discussions about art in what was at that time a very provincial city. But I conjecture that it was through contacts that they made in Rome that they ended up in São Paulo, because there was a lot of Eastern European artists going to Brazil actually passed through Italy, strangely enough. So
and Valdemar Cordeiro.
Exactly. That was the main contact, yeah.
But yeah, her European extraction was not as strong as your first example, in the sense of the way that she was absorbed into the Venezuelan narrative. On the contrary, I would actually insist that it was this kind of birthing story, this kind of national birthing story that was tied to her arrival in the land. And that's the way it's kind of told. And there is really an erasure of her kind of German emigre status. She's really a Venezuelan artist, and you know, in the kind of dominant scholarship. So it is a different case study from the one that you're offering, in terms of the birthing myth.
I was not going to say anything, but you pushed me a little bit there, because I think we talked a little bit about this yesterday. But it's about 48 again. See, the name 48 comes back again. And I think the interesting story I was fascinated by one event in 1948 at the time with Léon de Gand, going back to, you know, trying to step. But what was fascinating to me was the fact that Brazil is seen as already then a new power, but they wanted to be modern. They wanted to be, some of them. And so you have a major museum already with Matisse, Cézanne, and all that stuff by Chateaubriand, who owns this fantastic museum. But then you have the Matarazzo, who is the king of the sardine, I call him, who wanted to make a case, and he wants to build a new museum, a modern museum, because that shows that Brazil is moving up and in the world. And so that's in 48. The brother of Magnelli, who is in Paris, goes to Paris, and they have a discussion with de Gand, and he says, well, Matarazzo would like you to create a new museum there. It's a long story, so I'm going to be short. And so what he does, he goes around all his friends in Paris, and he gathers all kinds of paintings, abstract paintings, and he wanted to create a museum of history of modern art in Sao Paulo. So he does that, and he has a contact in New York, and Castelli is there to try to to gather abstract expressionist painters very early, 47, but that doesn't work because neither of the galleries dies just at that time, so they don't have enough money, and so the boat goes to Sao Paulo full of French abstract. But when Rockefeller heard about that, Nelson says, I wanted to counteract this, and he asks for his secretary and also one of the curator of the MoMA to go around Soho and whatever at that time with the other part to buy example of abstract American artists, and he carries them himself on a plane to have a show over there. But the battle was already there, and in Brazil they have to make choices. They have to say where are we going to go. And to be short, what is going to be interesting was to me is that the rebellion of some, that's what we talked about yesterday, the rebellion of some of the people in this new museum, which was kind of weird, was in a glass tower and so on. But some of those people, Brazilian people, thought that this was an imposition from the West, a neo-colonization through this kind of modern art, and when Degas finished the organization and he left for a vacation of a week, when he came back, they transformed completely the thing. All the white walls that he put on were painted blue, red, yellow, and all the fauteuil, what do you call it, the armchairs that were very modern, they were black and white. They were all covered with the flower cloth. That was their statement, saying, you're not going to be able to do this here, man, just go back. And actually, he had to go back. It didn't work, and he had to take all the boat back to his friends, and he didn't sell anything because he thought he was going to sell. He did a show in Argentina. The show, before going to Europe, stopped in Argentina, and that was it. And that the guy died 2 years later, exhausted, I guess. And his wife talks about that too, and lots of letters. And it's a fascinating story about this attempt to become extremely modern, right?
But then, of course, you have the Italians arriving in the form of the Bargis, and then you get the sort of Italian axis. So yeah, there's a lot of strands at play in São Paulo.
And since you mentioned 1948, how does the Congress in Wrocław fits into 1948, the International Congress, which really is a place where the confrontation between Russia and the Soviet Union and the West happens?
Well, you mean the ICA?
No.
Oh.
The World the Congress. What was the name of the Congress? This was the International Youth Congress or whatever, where Picasso comes and Leger comes. Peace Congress, right? Yes. How does it fit into that conversation?
I don't really sure, because in France the Communist Party supports it, but not the other. I mean, nobody besides the Communist Party and Picasso goes there, and even Picasso has lots of trouble there. I mean, there's lots of trouble with the Russian intellectuals. And
but Picasso came to Wrocław. He came here, and it was one of the only trips that he made by plane. And there is a very interesting story, because to convince him, actually, they went to visit him in France, and I don't remember who that person was, but he brought a very attractive young woman with him, and who also had a tattoo from a concentration camp, and that was the reason why Picasso actually made something which he never made. He took a plane and flew to Poland.
I don't know the impact of that. I know the impact in Paris, but in the press and so on, but I don't know the.
Yeah. No, because it was very interesting, because it was also when Leger came here, and he left very quickly. Because in a way Picasso sort of overshadowed Leger, and they were these two kind of vectors of modernism, and then there were others, who
but in that year, 1948, what was interesting is also, maybe we mentioned yesterday, also the art critics symposium in Paris in 48, and then in Switzerland.
1948, so right. 1948 was UNESCO organized the first conference of art criticism.
The discussion is unbelievable.
And ICA was formed the next year, yes.
And 48 is also, of course, the foundation of the State of Israel, which we should add here to our. But to go back actually to what, what's her name? Milada was saying, just, I do want to acknowledge it, I do think there is a belated reception of the Eastern Jew in some way, but I think it's a case of thinking about museological structures rather than a kind of gossip or an anecdote and how that really works. I know that in the State of Israel, for example, the German Jew in the hierarchy of kind of absorption obviously received kind of primary absorption into the aesthetic lexicon, and after that, the kind of Eastern Jew. But it would have to be a close kind of examination of the museological power structures in their place.
I agree with this. What about Chagall, for example? Typical East Jew.
He was an exception.
No. Actually, most of the artists of Jewish origin important in the 20s, in the 30s, was of
well, via Paris, not via the shtetl.
They came from Eastern
via
Europe.
Via Paris.
Yeah.
So it's not from the
Yeah,
shtetl.
but definitely they weren't. They didn't represent this group that was called in the 20s West Jude. Definitely.
But via Paris and via the language of the school of Paris. And I'm talking about here, I guess, the kind of institutionalization of a certain architecture of the kibbutz, for example, and not you know, if we're talking about Israel in particular, but I would say that there definitely was the mediation of the school of Paris. It's not a kind of pure primitive, you know, lexicon of the essentialist like Schlemiel. It's really mediated through the school of Paris.
Yeah, I think she's right, you know. So if you were from Eastern Europe, you had to go through Paris. You couldn't come directly from Vilnius or from Kiev. Or, but I think what you ask, actually, there is, I think there is a story that there is a privileging of sort of German-speaking Jews over the East European kind of Jews in the programs of the Jewish Museum, which it's okay, you know. It's I mean, it's you know.
I really can't answer to that. Yeah. I tried, and obviously, I know nothing about it. So. Yeah.
But why, like in my experience of reading all the archives of the museum, right? I was talking about this the battles, and pretty strong battle for 2 years. I never seen any discussion about Jewish people or Jewish stuff. It doesn't. It's not there. I mean, people do not raise that issue at all. So.
Where, in Brazil?
In Brazil. In Brazil?
Yeah. Oh no! I mean, if you deal with Paolo Henkerkoff's scholarship, it's full of those issues.
No, but then I mean, not then.
Now.
Yeah, no, it was it. I mean, the immigrants from Jewish immigrants from Poland certainly were part of a network of Jewish immigrants from Poland, and I mean, but no, you're right. There wasn't sort of a payoff in the art scene, in terms of, you know, the museums recognizing that or highlighting that. No.
But now, Paolo's scholarships, it's in large part about those issues.
Now is another story. I mean,
yeah.
It's
no,
another.
I'm talking about now, not historically.
But one of the reasons that Lazar Segal did so well in Brazil was he came. He and his German wife very quickly divorced. She went back to Germany. He married a Brazilian woman whose parents were Lithuanian Jewish, and became absorbed very quickly in a sort of upper class, sort of bourgeois Lithuanian Jewish immigrant community in São Paulo. And so, you know, that clearly a lot of his early sort of commissions that he earned money were through that community indirectly. So it's definitely in play, but it's just not. I have not read. I read hardly anything explicit about it from that era.
And maybe that's where the narrative of this kind of modernist narrative of the nation state that evacuates any notion, or not any, but evacuates racialization is important to note, that there is some kind of comparative situation that we can construct in terms of how different modernisms evacuated the identity, particularized identity, in favor of this kind of championing of capitalist abstraction.
Yes and no. In Brazil, I mean, in the 30s and 40s, there was actually a sort of muralist movement that privileged us this myth of racial harmony in Brazil, where everyone was, the myth of the three happy races is what it's called. And then I argue actually that in the post-war period, in part because of all this immigration, there was a sort of, well, to be Brazilian is not necessarily to be this sort of Portuguese, black, indigenous melding any longer. It's also to be an immigrant. And so part of the reason I agree with you that the geometric abstraction in part sort of cleanses this visual representation of what it means to be Brazilian, and to be Brazilian is to be modern in this deracialized way. But I think it comes a little, it's for me, it's in the post-war period. I think in the earlier period that's not happening yet.
Yes, I would agree with you in that way, that I'm pointing to the national construction in the post-war period.
Yeah.
Just maybe one more remark about Brazil, and I think it's probably at the end of the conference I wanted to bring it back to Łódź to some extent, for the reason, as Serge Guibault was saying, that Brazil made a conscious effort to counter the influence of Northern America and New York, especially with the organization of ArtLife. And I wanted specifically to mention Ryszard Stanisławski, who was the major director of this institution, who was responsible for Polish shows in the Sao Paulo Biennial from late 50s until mid-60s. And the fact is that he was championed by the organizers so much that he was always called to be a member of the jury. He represented, as I assume, he was two members of the jury from Europe, and he was one of them. He was given enormous recognition in Brazil in terms of media coverage. He was giving lectures at the universities when he came. So there was a conscious effort to actually recognize this part of Europe as an important factor. Also because the Poles were at that time, Polish state was representing the interest of the Soviet Union, who Brazil was not in a diplomatic relationship at that time with Soviet Union. So there was a sense that there needs to be like an emphasis on the fact that these artists or people from here are given a very prominent position there. And also the Polish artists were given prizes, significant prizes in biennial, and I think it was also politically motivated to show that Brazil is kind of recognizing artists from this part of the world that is not recognized universally, that means in the United States. And in this respect, you could argue that if Żarnower decided not to go to New York, but to go to Brazil or Argentina, she would be much easier recognized in terms of the Latin American context. She would have made it much further in her career, probably. So that's a fantasy.
Or if she had a twin, right? Because often Jewish families would separate, and there was history when half of the family would go to Brazil and half of the family would come to the United States, right? So, I mean, maybe the twin, if she had a twin, the twin in Brazil, who knows what would happen to the twin? Yeah. But that connection, Stanisławski connection, I think is through actually ICA, through Mario Pedrosa, who was very much involved with ICA, and Stanisławski was part of ICA, and those connections back then were very important. And Pedrosa had a whole philosophy about how to transform Brazilian art from concrete kind of aspect, right? So, yeah.
Sorry, thanks. The battle continues like in the 50s with the piece that we're talking about with Picasso and so on. So the battle between France and the US, they are not confronting like that, but it's underneath. For example, in Argentina, the French are really involved culturally, but also economically. I mean, Argentina was the only country where you could buy French cars, in the late 50s. And Americans could not believe it, that you would go there and you have Dauphine all over the place. Poor Argentinian, because a Dauphine was not a very good car, but still, that was very important. And even now, when you go there, you have Peugeot, the French are still there trying to, well, not anymore, but in the last 10 years, in a sense. That was quite an important issue. So the pictures. And Greenberg, for example, in Argentina, was sent to Argentina. And you know the story about when Greenberg went there, and they asked him, they show him all the artists working there. And what he said was, well, you are too much like, you're just too provincial. What you do is not really on the level of and so on, because what's important now is expressionism and that and this. So those guys, they kind of change. A year later, they invite him back and they say, look, what are we doing? So, well, no, that was not good because you're too much like us and, there's no way out. So, and those guys were really pissed. And when you read the letters and you can see that they were really talking about that, saying, so what do we do, kind of. And that was kind of interesting because they in Argentina at that time, that was in late 50s, I think, they really wanted to be, to be somebody in a sense, like quote unquote. Because at that time, we didn't have the idea that you could be yourself. At first they thought, but right away you are provincial. And in that world, that was a terrible word. I mean, so. But Greenberg was still very, very powerful. Right. So you had to deal with that.
Who was it? Manzoni? He was one of the Italians. He was very much part of it. But anyway, maybe pan Paweł, zakończymy pomału jakimś takim słowem zamykającym, więc może by pan coś powiedział i wtedy ja ewentualnie parę słów. Nie, no proszę. Okej, no ja przede wszystkim, ale to Jarku, tak.
Tak, ja bardzo chciałem podziękować wszystkim uczestnikom tej konferencji. Raz jeszcze za przyjęcie zaproszenia. Bardzo dziękuję tym osobom, które dzisiaj dzięki swoim wystąpieniom bardzo poszerzyły kontekst, w jakim lokowana może być twórczość Teresy Żarnower. Myślę, że to jest bardzo istotne dla jej przyszłej recepcji. Im więcej takich punktów odniesienia czy perspektyw, z których będziemy mogli spojrzeć na tę twórczość, tym lepiej, tym bardziej złożony i pełny może być jej obraz. Także no ja chciałem na zakończenie tylko bardzo serdecznie podziękować i oczywiście zaprosić na otwarcie wystawy Teresy Żarnower we wrześniu. Mam nadzieję, że wszyscy Państwo będziecie mogli przyjechać i skonfrontować te swoje wizje z konkretnymi pracami, z oryginalną twórczością Teresy Żarnower. Także bardzo dziękuję.